The village was filled with ghosts and spirits. As the golden sunset bathed the sky in a crimson hue, the village of Tamjiang lay nestled among deep green mountain ranges, appearing hazy and dreamlike. Winding paths meandered from one end of the village to the other, covered in reddish-brown earth bearing the marks of time. Beside these roads, a stream snaked through the rice fields, which were in full bloom, creating swirling reflections of the fading sunlight. In the distance, thatched roof houses stood scattered, accompanied by an ancient banyan tree, its gnarled roots gripping the earth like the fingers of an old man. At the heart of the village, the banyan tree stood tall, a silent witness to countless changes, its shadow stretching over the village like a remnant of the feudal era. The people here lived by age-old beliefs, celebrating annual festivals and holding sacred ceremonies under the flickering light of oil lamps before the old shrine. This atmosphere, both mystical and solemn, carried a chilling presence, as if an unseen force was watching over the village's slow, steady rhythm. As twilight faded, Tamjiang was gradually swallowed by an eerie silence. The distant barking of dogs echoed, and the wind whispered through the bamboo groves. Yet something felt off. An ominous, elusive presence seemed to lurk in the darkness, spreading across the dirt paths, stretching endlessly, as if leading people into another realm, one where the boundary between reality and illusion blurred. The village was home to only a few hundred households, and legend had it that in the past life here was simple and uneventful. The land was harsh, with harvests coming and going unpredictably, leaving the villagers in a quiet, unchanging existence. However, about 30 years ago, everything suddenly changed. The once struggling village became prosperous with bountiful harvests and abundant food. People started saving wealth and life grew better, until one fateful night. A violent storm swept through Tamjiang, bringing howling winds that roared, like waves crashing in the silent night. The fierce gusts rattled the earthen walls, slipping through every crevice, striking fear into the hearts of those listening. Roofs trembled as if about to be torn away. That night, from the elderly to the children, the entire village huddled in the safest corners of their homes, silently praying for the storm to pass and spare their houses. The wind howled with relentless fury, testing the villagers' courage. Then came the deafening wrath of the thunder god. Explosive claps of thunder crashed overhead, shaking the ground, while blinding streaks of lightning, as thick as water jars, lit up the endless darkness for mere moments before vanishing again. The torrential rain poured down, drenching the parched earth, releasing a damp, suffocating scent. Children, frightened by the chaos, wailed inconsolably, their cries echoing through the village. Mothers held them close, gently rocking them in their arms, too afraid to sing lullabies for fear of provoking the storm further. In one humble thatched house, much like any other in the village, a young man stood by the window, staring out into the storm. His eyes were filled with worry and deep thought. Behind him, an old man, likely in his 60s, noticed the young man's daze and spoke up. "Thuk, come inside. If you keep standing there, the storm will strike you dead." The young man turned, let out a small chuckle, and walked over to sit in front of the old man. He glanced up at the family altar and gestured toward it. "Grandfather, there's no one left to be struck down." The old man scowled. "You brat, always talking back. What are you staring at? Do you see something?" Thuk sighed in frustration, then silently retreated to his bed, lying down with a troubled look on his face. Tamjiang village was a place filled with ghosts and spirits. As the sun set, casting a crimson glow over the sky, the village nestled itself within deep green mountain ranges, appearing hazy, like a dream that had not yet faded. Winding dirt paths stretched from the village's entrance to its farthest corners, covered in reddish-brown earth, marked by the passage of time. Beside these roads, a winding stream snaked through the rice fields, which were in full bloom, creating swirling reflections of the fading sunlight. In the distance, scattered thatched roof houses could be seen, standing lonely beside an ancient banyan tree. Its gnarled roots twisted like the fingers of an old man, gripping the earth firmly as if it had been there for centuries. At the heart of the village, the towering banyan tree stood tall, an eternal witness to the countless changes. that had swept through Tamjiang over the years. Like a silent guardian, its shadow loomed over the village, an ever-present reminder of the feudal era. The people here lived by traditions passed down through generations, faithfully observing their annual festivals and sacred rituals. On certain nights under the dim flicker of oil lamps, villagers would gather at the old shrine to offer prayers, their voices blending into the night silence. This place carried an atmosphere both mystical and solemn, as if unseen eyes were always watching, following the slow, steady rhythm of life in Tamjiang. When the last sliver of twilight faded, the village was swallowed by an eerie stillness. From afar, the distant barking of dogs echoed, accompanied by the whispering wind weaving through the bamboo groves. Yet something felt off. A strange, unsettling presence seemed to linger in the darkness, moving through the shadowed pathways. The dirt roads, once familiar, now stretched endlessly, as if leading wanderers into another realm, a place where the boundaries between reality and illusion blurred. Despite its long history, Tamjiang was home to only a few hundred households. According to old tales, the village had once been sparsely populated, with people struggling through years of hardship. Harvests were uncertain, one year bountiful, the next year barren. The villagers lived simple, uneventful lives, neither prospering nor declining. But about 30 years ago, something changed. Suddenly, the once impoverished village began to thrive. The fields bore abundant crops, the weather was kind, and for the first time the people had enough to eat, even enough to save. Then, one fateful night, a storm unlike any before descended upon Tamjiang. Dark clouds loomed over the village, swallowing the sky whole. Thunder rumbled like boiling waves crashing against the heavens, and the wind howled, forcing its way through every crack and crevice. The walls of the earthen houses trembled under the force of the storm, as if ready to collapse at any moment. Fear gripped the villagers. From the elderly to the youngest children, they all huddled in the safest corners of their homes, whispering prayers to the heavens, pleading for the storm to pass without taking their lives or homes. The wind roared, its fury unrelenting, shaking doors and windows with terrifying force. Then came the wrath of the thunder god. Blinding flashes of lightning as thick as water jars illuminated the sky, followed by thunderclaps so loud they rattled the bones of those who heard them. The downpour that followed was relentless, drenching the parched earth, releasing a damp, suffocating scent that clung to the air. The sudden change in atmosphere frightened the children, making them cry uncontrollably. Their wails cut through the storm, causing mothers to clutch them tightly, gently rocking them in their arms. Yet, even in their attempts to soothe their children, none dared to sing a lullaby, as if afraid that any sound might provoke the storm further. In one modest, thatched house, like many others in the village, a young man stood by the window, gazing out at the raging storm. His eyes, filled with worry and deep thought, reflected the occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the darkened room. Behind him, an old man, likely in his 60s, watched for a moment before speaking in a gruff voice. "Tuck, come, inside. If you keep standing there, the storm will strike you dead." The young man turned, letting out a small chuckle. He walked over and sat in front of the old man, then glanced up at the family altar and pointed toward it. "Grandfather, there's no one left to be struck down anymore." The old man scowled. "You brat, always talking back. What are you staring at? Do you see something?" Thuk sighed, exasperated, then silently walked to his sleeping mat. He lay down, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought as the storm continued to rage outside. Thuk let out a sigh and muttered, "Going out in the storm won't change anything. I was just checking if the chicken coop was flooded, that's all, Grandpa." His grandfather, who had been quietly rolling tobacco, lit his pipe and took a deep, deliberate drag. After a moment, he sipped his tea, then let out a loud exhale, one that nearly drowned out the sound of the heavy rain outside. "When you've lived long enough, you'll understand," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "There are things in life that follow a pattern. They come swiftly and leave just as fast. The real question is, what consequences do they leave behind?" Thuk frowned. "Grandpa, why do you always talk in riddles? Every time I ask you something, you say I'll understand later. When is later? I'm 30 years old already." You've been saying that since I was a kid, and honestly, it's getting frustrating." Annoyed, Thuk rolled onto his side and pulled the blanket over himself, signaling that he didn't want to hear any more of his grandfather's cryptic words. He had lived with the old man ever since his parents had passed away when he was still a child. Over the years, he had come to realize that his grandfather's words always carried hidden meanings. When he was younger, he paid little attention to them, but now, as he grew older, he started to notice. His grandfather's words often felt like riddles containing layers of mystery. Many times Thuk had tried to decipher them. There were moments when he felt he was on the verge of understanding, only for the meaning to slip away, leaving him feeling even more confused. It was an unsettling feeling, like knowing something but not quite grasping it. Seeing Thuk deep in thought, his grandfather said nothing more. Instead, he quietly blew out the candle on the family altar, stood up, and walked to the window. He gazed out into the rain, raising a hand to calculate something in his mind. His lips moved in a barely audible whisper, speaking words only he could hear. "It's almost time. I hope that when the day comes, you will understand. I hope you'll be strong enough that you won't let yourself be consumed by it." The old man stood by the window for a long time. When he finally turned around, Thuk had already fallen asleep. Letting out a quiet sigh, he walked toward the door. Without hesitation, he stepped outside, allowing the rain to drench him completely. As he walked into the storm, he suddenly stopped and turned back, gazing at the house where he had spent nearly his entire life. He stood there for a moment as if memorizing every detail. A bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating his face. His eyes, red, sunken, reflected the storm's eerie glow. Was he crying, or was it just the rain running down his face? No one would ever know. The morning after the storm, the next morning, the village was blanketed in a cold, damp silence. The storm had passed, but the sky remained dark and overcast. A thick layer of mist curled through the village, clinging to the rooftops and winding through the narrow dirt paths. Droplets of rain still clung to the leaves, occasionally falling onto the thatched roofs before dripping onto the muddy ground below. The air was thick with moisture, and the lingering cold seeped into the bones of anyone who stepped outside. Everything was eerily still, until a sudden, piercing scream shattered the silence. "Help, help, Bao-an is dead!" The cry came from Madame Jam, her voice shrill and desperate. The chilling wail echoed through the village, sending shivers down the spines of those who heard it. The early morning calm was instantly broken, replaced by the frantic whispers of curiosity and fear. People rushed out of their homes, their curiosity overpowering their caution. One by one, they hurried in the direction of the scream, their footsteps quickening as unease settled over the village, like a shadow. What had happened, and why, deep in their hearts, did they feel as though this was only the beginning? Even Thuk, though still groggy from sleep, was no exception to the commotion. He quickly grabbed his worn-out straw hat and placed it on his head, shielding himself from the lingering drizzle. Without hesitation, he merged into the surging crowd making their way toward Bao-an's house. That morning, Thuk had noticed his grandfather was nowhere to be found. He figured the old man had likely gone to Bao-an's house early, so as he hurried along, he couldn't help but grumble under his breath. "Grandpa sure is quick on his feet. Left before me and didn't even bother waking me up." As Bao-an's thatched house came into view, a sense of unease settled in Thuk's chest. The house stood alone in the midst of a devastated landscape. The storm had ravaged it beyond recognition. Its roof had been ripped away, leaving only a skeletal frame of broken wooden beams. The supporting pillars were either shattered or leaning at unnatural angles, while fallen trees and damp, rotting leaves littered the ground. The wooden door had been blown open, with one half barely hanging onto its hinges while the other lay discarded outside. But more than the destruction, there was something eerily unnatural about the house. It no longer felt like a place where the living resided. A chilling emptiness clung to the air, as if the house itself had been severed from the world of the living. Villagers huddled outside, exchanging hushed whispers while stealing uneasy glances toward the ruins. The murmurs grew into a soft chorus of fear and speculation. Some of the elderly women began muttering prayers under their breath, clutching their amulets as they did so. Children, sensing the tension, hid behind the legs of their parents, peeking out cautiously at the unsettling scene. Though no one spoke it outright, they all shared the same unspoken thought. Something about this death was not normal. The gray morning, combined with the lingering drizzle, only amplified the bleakness of the situation. The villagers poured in from all directions, drawn to the scene like a stream rushing toward its source. Along the village path, voices rose in hushed but urgent conversations. Some pointed at the wreckage, while others shuddered at the horrific sight. The stronger men entered the house, helping to clear the debris, while the women gathered outside, eager to hear every chilling detail. Thuk found himself unable to push through the growing crowd. Instead, he made his way toward a group of gossiping older women, hoping to catch the latest news. As he approached, one of them, an elderly woman named Ba Tu, the first to have discovered the body, was already deep into her account of what had happened. Horrible. Simply horrible, she whispered, though her voice carried far enough for everyone to hear. He died right there, on his bed. A beam from the roof collapsed and impaled him, went clean through his body. His insides spilled out. She shuddered, hands trembling as if recalling the gruesome sight in vivid detail. Just as Thuk was absorbing her words, she added, "And to think just last week your grandfather warned them to reinforce the house, but they wouldn't listen. Ha! Even mocked him for being an old fool, saying, 'The weather is fine.' What? Storm? Well, look where that arrogance got them." Her words struck Thuk like a lightning bolt, sending his thoughts spiraling back to the heated argument that had taken place in the village hall just days ago. That day, his grandfather, Old Than, had been the only one to predict an incoming storm. He had warned the villagers to brace themselves, advising them to reinforce their homes and harvest their crops early. Even if the rice was still unripe, he insisted they cut it immediately. But no one believed him. Bao An's son, Tak, had been the loudest in opposing his grandfather's warnings. He had stood before the entire village and shouted, "So just because Old Than says there's going to be a storm, we're all supposed to listen? Where's the proof? We can't just harvest green rice. What are we supposed to eat if the crop isn't ready?" Most of the villagers had nodded in agreement, dismissing the old man's words as nonsense. Even though Thuk had secretly believed his grandfather, he had kept silent, standing behind him but saying nothing. At that time, a few others had also quietly supported his grandfather, but they were hesitant to speak up. After all, for many years, Tamjang had enjoyed good weather and prosperous harvests. Why should this year be any different? The rice was heavy with grain, promising the best yield in years, and now they were being told to cut it all down based on nothing but an old man's intuition? It was absurd. His grandfather had simply sighed, saying nothing more. He had returned home in silence, only instructing Thuk to harvest their own rice immediately and secure everything they could before it was too late. Now, standing before the ruins of Bao An's home, Thuk could only feel a chilling sense of inevitable. Some villagers, though skeptical, chose to follow Old Tan's advice in silence. They reinforced their homes and harvested their rice early, just in case. A week passed, and it seemed as though nothing was going to happen. In fact, the weather only grew hotter with each passing day, giving more reason for the stubborn ones to mock those who had listened to Old Than. Women who had refused to cut their rice began ridiculing their neighbors, making snide remarks and even cursing those who had harvested their crops early, calling them fools. Their laughter and scorn carried through the village, but the peaceful days did not last for long. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. The wind roared violently, and before anyone could react, the storm struck. It was exactly as Old Tana had predicted. In the dead of night, the once calm village was thrown into chaos. Wind and rain battered the homes, flooding the lower-lying areas. Thunder rumbled like an angry beast, and debris flew through the air. The terrified screams of villagers pierced the storm, mixed with the frantic barking of dogs. By dawn, the rain had subsided, but the sky remained shrouded in heavy, ominous clouds. No one doubted that the storm wasn't over yet. The first casualty of the disaster was quickly discovered. Bao An was dead. His house was in ruins, reduced to little more than shattered beams and broken walls. The full extent of the damage across the village was still unknown, but one thing was certain: the storm had left destruction in its wake. Without wasting time, the men of the village gathered to help clear the wreckage under the direction of the village chief, Khan. Some were sent to purchase a coffin, while others helped build a temporary shelter where the funeral rites could be held. Thuk had been searching for his grandfather since morning, but hadn't seen him anywhere. He assumed the old man had gone, off to assist those whose homes had been flooded, and decided not to worry. Instead, he focused on helping with the rescue efforts. As fate would have it, he found himself assisting near the spot where Bao An's lifeless body lay. The sight sent a chill down Thuk's spine. Bao An's corpse was sprawled motionless, his skin a sickly pale hue. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of horror, and his mouth was slightly ajar, as if he had died trying to say something. As the men lifted the heavy wooden beam that had impaled him, a thick, dark liquid oozed from the wound, seeping into the wet earth. The putrid scent of blood mixed with damp soil filled the air, making several people gag. But then, something strange happened. Thuk's breath hitched, his body stiffened as a sense of unease crept up his spine. Bao An's mouth was open, but his tongue was missing. For a moment, Thuk could only stand there, frozen. His mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. Maybe the accident had caused him to bite it off. Maybe animals had gotten to it first. But no, something about this was all wrong. Whispers erupted among the villagers. His tongue... "It's gone," someone gasped. "How could this happen?" Another muttered in shock. The murmurs spread like wildfire, and fear gripped the crowd. The village had seen misfortune before, but never anything like this. Even the bravest among them could feel a cold dread creeping into their bones. For a long time, Thuk simply stood there, staring at the body. Unlike the others, he had been exposed to death many times before. Having worked alongside his grandfather, he had seen more corpses than he could count. Yet something about this one unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Bao An, the woman who had once been the loudest, always gossiping, always speaking ill of others, was now dead, unable to utter a single word ever again. A sudden voice snapped Thuk out of his trance. "Thuk, where's your grandfather?" It was Khan, the village chief. Among the villagers, he was one of the most respected figures, a man whose word carried weight. Over time, people had begun referring to him simply as Chief, forgetting his actual name. Thuk turned to face him, still dazed. "I don't know, sir. When I woke up this morning, he was already gone." Khan's expression darkened. His sharp, weathered features grew tense, his jaw tightening. "Strange," he muttered. "A disaster like this, and yet your grandfather is nowhere to be seen?" He shook his head in frustration before looking back at Thuk. "Go find him. Tell him to return immediately and oversee the funeral rites. No one else in this village knows the proper rituals. If he doesn't come back soon, we won't know what to do." Thuk swallowed hard and nodded. "Understood." As he turned to leave, the rain began to fall again, light at first, then steadily increasing. Somehow, deep in his heart, Thuk had a terrible feeling that this was only the beginning. Thuk quickly threw on his raincoat, slinging it over his shoulders before stepping out into the storm. The wind and rain lashed against his face as he trudged through the flooded village, searching for his grandfather. The sky remained heavy, with dark clouds, and though the worst of the storm had passed, lightning still crackled across the sky, followed by deafening claps of thunder that made even the bravest shudder. His footsteps splashed through the thick mud as he made his way, eastward toward the lower-lying part of the village, where many homes sat partially submerged in murky floodwaters. Thatched roofs and tiled rooftops bobbed just above the water's surface, looking like small boats adrift on a vast, muddy sea. Occasionally, the water rippled as floating debris collided, sending gentle waves lapping against what remained of the village. Thuk moved from house to house, tirelessly asking the same question: "Have you seen my grandfather?" Again and again he received the same response. No one had seen him. It was as if the old man had vanished without a trace. Worry gnawed at Thuk's heart as he scanned the landscape, his exhaustion barely registering amid his growing anxiety. He searched every road, every alley, even venturing toward the southern fields where his grandfather often tended the rice during the harvest season. He stopped by the village shrine, the old banyan tree, and every place his grandfather frequently visited, but there was no sign of him. A troubling thought crossed his mind. Could he have gone to the neighboring village to help with the flood? It was possible, but unlikely. His grandfather had never left the village without informing him, not even once. And if it had been urgent, he would have at least left a note. A note. Thuk felt a spark of hope and immediately turned back toward home. His heart pounded as he ran, splashing through puddles, praying that his grandfather had simply left him a message and that he had overlooked it in his haste. Reaching the house, he pushed open the door and hurried to his grandfather's room. His eyes darted around, scanning the usual spots where the old man would leave notes in case of emergencies. But this time, there was no piece of paper, no hastily scribbled message. Instead, something else caught his eye. A neatly folded piece of white cloth placed carefully inside a small wooden box at the head of the bed. At first, Thuk thought it was just an old handkerchief, perhaps the one his grandmother had given his grandfather long ago. But as he unfolded it, his breath caught. The cloth was embroidered with elegant flowing script, far too refined for his grandfather to have done himself. Thuk knew his grandfather well. The old man struggled with even the simplest sewing, tasks often pricking his fingers just trying to mend a torn sleeve. There was no way he could have embroidered something this intricate. A sense of unease crept over him as he slowly read the words aloud. The earth trembles, the heavens roar, the black clouds gather, the storm rages. Thunder's wrath descends upon. Tam Jang, life and death bound by fate, one word seals all. The words felt heavy, like a prophecy carved by unseen hands. As Thuk read, a chill spread through his body. Certain phrases stood out. Thunder's wrath, life and death, Tam Jang. They echoed like warnings in his mind. His gaze shifted downward to another set of verses embroidered beneath the first. With a growing sense of dread, he continued reading. When rice blooms on the path, when lotus flowers split their stems, when the old dog bears young, when the rooster crows mournfully at night, then shall the 5 organs return to dust. The living shall wander, the dead shall rise. Thuk's hands tightened around the cloth. The words felt ancient, like an omen passed down through generations. There was an eerie rhythm to them, a dark cadence that sent a shiver through his bones. He read them again, hoping to make sense of their meaning. But the more he tried, the more unsettled he felt. Then, just below the final lines of the prophecy, his eyes landed on something else. An embroidered image of a mountain with 3 distinct peaks. At the highest point, a lone bamboo tree stood tall and solitary. Thuk's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what the mountain or the bamboo symbolized, but something about it unnerved him. Had his grandfather left this behind as a clue, or had it been placed here by someone else? He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved that he had found a sign from his grandfather, or terrified by the ominous message it carried. One thing was certain: his grandfather had not left this behind by accident. Setting the cloth back into the wooden box, Thuk took a deep breath. His mind raced with questions, but answers remained elusive. Feeling a sudden urge to search for more clues, he frantically rummaged through the house, overturning every object, searching for anything that might give him more information. But there was nothing. Defeated, he stepped outside, slumping onto a wooden bench by the entrance. His fingers absent-mindedly drummed against the table as he stared blankly into the distance. Where had his grandfather gone? And what did the prophecy mean? Thuk sat at the table, his fingers drumming absent-mindedly as his mind swirled with worry. Where could Grandpa have gone without leaving any clue? As he sat lost in thought, his stomach suddenly growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything since morning. Just as he decided to head to the kitchen to find something to eat, a loud voice called from outside. "An Thuk! An Thuk oi!" Thuk stood up and opened the door to find 2 a fellow villager, standing outside, panting heavily. His face was flushed, but his eyes lit up with relief upon seeing Thuk. Antuk, the village chief wants to know if you found your grandfather yet. If not, you should come help with the burial rites. We need to prepare Bao An's body before taking him to the burial site tonight. Thuk furrowed his brows, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Wait. What? Why are we burying him tonight? Tu simply shrugged, his face still tense with concern. I don't know, either. The chief said the storm is unpredictable, and he doesn't want to delay any longer. We have to handle it as soon as possible. Thuk nodded slowly. He understood the traditions of his village well. Preparing a body for burial wasn't just a funeral ritual. It was a sacred ceremony meant to guide the deceased's spirit to a peaceful rest. If done improperly, the soul could linger, unable to pass on. For years, this duty had always fallen to his grandfather, the one man in the Yue village who truly understood the ancient rites and had the strength to deal with the world of the dead. For the past 3 years, his grandfather had brought him along to observe, teaching him every step of the process. One day, this task will be yours, his grandfather had told him. But now, at the moment the village needed him most, his grandfather had vanished. Shoving his unease aside, Thuk followed Tu toward the funeral site. When they arrived, everything had already been prepared. The altar, the coffin, even the mourning banners. The villagers had worked quickly. Thuk took a deep breath, steeling himself against the wave of nerves washing over him. This was the first time he would be leading the ritual on his own. He still remembered every word, every gesture his grandfather had performed over the years. The steps were etched into his mind. But now, standing before Bao An's lifeless body, surrounded by incense smoke curling through the dimly lit space, a heavy weight settled on his chest. The village chief stood beside him, watching. After a moment, he gave Thuk a slight nod, signaling him to begin. Your grandfather isn't here, the chief said solemnly. So it's up to you now. In this village, no one else can perform this ritual except his bloodline. Thuk swallowed, hard, and nodded. He didn't know the origins of this tradition, but ever since he could remember, his grandfather had always been the one to oversee these rites. It wasn't just about sending off the dead. It was the final bridge between the living and the deceased, the last farewell to ensure a peaceful passing. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. Bao An's body lay still beneath a thin burial cloth, his face covered by a white shroud. He looked peaceful, yet something about him felt unsettled. Thuk carefully lit 3 sticks of incense. The fragrant smoke drifted through the air as he knelt beside the body, raising the incense to his forehead. His voice was steady as he began the prayer. Spirit of Lê Thu Oan, hear my call. I, Nguyen Van Thuk, on behalf of the villagers, the family and the spirits beyond, prepare to lay you to rest. Your time in this world has ended. Return to the earth. Let your soul pass into the afterlife. May your spirit find peace in the realm beyond, free from regrets, free from vengeance. Do not linger in this world, do not become a restless ghost. Those who harbor resentment will be trapped, burdened by their own sins, unable to reincarnate. If any mistakes are made in this ritual, may they be forgiven and may your soul be at peace. His voice rang out through the silent hall, firm, unwavering. It was as much a reassurance for the living as it was for the dead. And yet, despite his steady tone, a strange feeling gnawed at the edges of his mind. Something didn't feel right. A heavy silence settled over the gathering. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Every villager bowed their heads, standing in solemn reverence, as if silently praying for Bao An's soul to find peace, to let go of all attachments to the living world. Just as Thuk finished his prayer, an eerie gust of wind suddenly swept through the room. The force of it made the white burial cloth covering Bao An's face shift slightly to the side, revealing his pale, lifeless features. His eyes, half open, seemed to be staring into nothingness, as though there was something he had yet to let go of. Thuk froze for a brief moment, A strange unease crept into his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. He steadied himself and continued wrapping the burial cloth around Bao-An's body, his lips still moving in quiet prayer. Outside, the wind howled louder, pressing against the walls as if whispering an unspoken warning. The intensity of the storm felt unnatural, almost as if urging him not to stop. Thuk pressed forward, kneeling fully as he called out in a strong, clear voice. First bow, respect to family, friends, and neighbors who mourn your passing. Second, bow, farewell to the flesh, for the body is no longer needed in this world. Third bow, gratitude to the heavens and earth for nurturing you until this moment. The villagers who had been quietly observing exchanged glances. They were surprised by Thuk's sudden composure and confidence. Though young, he carried out the rites with a solemn grace that was beyond his years. One by one, they bowed, their heads following his lead, silently entrusting him with this sacred duty. Thuk then stepped closer to Bao-An's body. His gaze lingered on the pale, motionless face, the eyes that refused to close completely. A wave of frustration and exhaustion swept over him. "Grandfather, why did you have to disappear now?" This was his first time leading a burial rite on his own, and it had to be for a body that was incomplete, marred by tragedy. Taking a deep breath, Thuk steadied his hands. He moved methodically, beginning the next step of the ritual. He took the prepared incense sticks and placed them into a banana tree trunk, an offering meant to guide the deceased soul. Then he turned toward the gathered villagers and bowed deeply. This was a formal request for permission to proceed with the cleansing ritual. Before him, a basin of warm water gave off a faint herbal fragrance. Beside it lay a neatly folded white cloth, a spool of black thread and a sharp needle gleaming under the dim light. As Thuk reached for the cloth, his fingers trembled slightly. He dipped it into the warm water, wrung it out, then gently pressed it against Bao-An's cold forehead. As he wiped away the lingering traces of life, he murmured a quiet prayer. According to tradition, the body had to be cleansed from head to toe before burial. This final act of care would allow the soul to leave the physical world without regret, ensuring a peaceful departure. Despite his steady hands, frustration churned inside him. "Of all times, grandfather, you had to disappear now? My first time, doing this alone, and I have to deal with a corpse that isn't even whole. What kind of cruel fate is this?" The room remained silent. No one interrupted, no one spoke. A deep respect filled the air, a collective understanding that something sacred was taking place. Though his grandfather was gone, Thuk had unknowingly stepped into his role. The responsibility had now fallen onto him, and the villagers silently acknowledged it. Still, as he continued his task, an unshakable frustration burned in his chest. He could still hear his grandfather's voice from years past. "Watch carefully, listen carefully, remember every detail of what I do." And for the first time, Thuk realized just how much those words truly meant. There will come a day when fate calls and you must take on this duty. When that time comes, stay calm. Follow every step as I have taught you. There is no need to rush. Remember that. His grandfather's words echoed in Thuk's mind as he dipped the cloth into the warm water and began wiping down Bao-An's body. Standing beside him was Bao-An's younger sister. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, yet she remained focused, watching Thuk's every move. Though she was grieving, she was well versed in funeral rites and quietly reminded him whenever he hesitated, ensuring that no steps were forgotten in preparing the deceased for burial. As the process continued, Thuk noticed that Bao-An's skin had begun to stiffen, his face and lips tightening as rigor mortis set in. This was normal, as the body would gradually become rigid after death. Just as Thuk gently wiped over Bao-An's eyelids, something unexpected happened. With a sudden jolt, Bao-An's eyes snapped open. The whites of his eyes were fully exposed, while the irises had rolled back, revealing only half. It was as if, in his final moments, he had witnessed something utterly horrifying. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Several villagers instinctively stepped backward, their faces pale with fear. Even Bao-An's own son and daughter-in-law clutched their child and retreated to the farthest corner of the room. Their expressions mirrored the horror-stricken thoughts racing through their minds. Had their mother truly passed away, or was she about to rise again? Like the terrifying stories of corpses reanimating possessed by wandering spirits. Thuk, being the closest, remained still, only slightly startled by the sudden movement. He knew exactly what was happening. Rigor mortis had begun, and with the combination of pressure and the warmth from the cleansing cloth, the muscles in the eyelids had contracted, causing them to open involuntarily. It was nothing supernatural, just a biological reaction. Turning toward the villagers, Thuk spoke calmly. "There's no need to be afraid. This is a natural reaction. Some bodies experience it, some don't." His steady voice reassured the crowd. After a long moment of silence, the tension in the room eased and people began to relax, though they still eyed the body warily. Once Thuk finished cleansing the body, it was time to sew the abdominal wound shut. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the cloth covering Bao-An's lower body and carefully pulled it back. The moment he did, a foul stench hit the air, thick, putrid, and suffocating. It spread like an invisible wave, filling the room and making everyone recoil. Some villagers covered their noses, faces twisted in disgust. Even those standing farther away instinctively turned their heads. Thuk, positioned closest to the body, bore the full brunt of the smell. It was so overpowering that his stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain composed. His grandfather had always warned him, no matter how bad it gets, never show discomfort. To do so is to disrespect the dead. If you flinch in disgust, you mock their remains. At best, you'll be cursed with misfortune. At worst, you'll suffer something far worse. Those words were etched into Thuk's memory, and now they guided his every move. He reached for the needle and thread, steadying his breath. Carefully, he began stitching the wound closed with precise, practiced motions. The villagers watched in silence, their eyes glued to every stitch he made. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for the young man carrying out this sacred task. Once the stitching was complete, Thuk signaled for the family to help change Bao-An into fresh burial clothes. Finally, he wrapped the body in a clean white shroud, securing it tightly before stepping back. Under the village chief's orders, the coffin was slowly prepared, and Bao-An's body was carefully placed inside. Everything moved quickly after that. The burial took place on the same day once the auspicious hour arrived. As darkness enveloped everything, within the hour they would need to carry the body to their burial ground. The rain was still falling in the burial shroud, was carried out into the yard by 8 men, and no one in the village dared to delay. They turned the coffin toward the house one last time as a farewell gesture. At the leader's command, all 8 bearers simultaneously bent their knees 3 times, a ritual of bidding farewell to the deceased's home. The leader shouted again, this time tossing a handful of joss paper into the air. The pieces scattered wildly with the wind. Though the storm had passed, strong gusts remained, causing the paper money to soar higher and farther before eventually settling over the torch-bearing procession. Everything seemed to be proceeding as expected until the funeral procession neared the burial site. Suddenly, one of the 8 pallbearers collapsed, convulsing violently with foam at the mouth. His seizure was so intense that the coffin slipped from their grip, rolling twice before landing upside down in a water-filled ditch. Chaos erupted. Panic spread through the mourners as they stared in shock at the lifeless man on the ground. Minutes passed before the village chief, Khan, bellowed, "What are you all standing there for? Spread out and catch your breath. And the rest of you, hurry up and lift the coffin. If water seeps inside, it will ruin everything." His words snapped the crowd out of their stupor. Under his orders, people scrambled into action. However, as if fate was toying with them, the coffin floated unsteadily on the murky water. It took over 10 men to finally overturn it. But the moment they did, an eerie realization struck. The coffin, which had been nailed shut securely, had somehow come undone. And worse yet, the body inside was gone. The 30-odd mourners went pale. In all their lives, none had ever witnessed such a thing. A coffin, sealed with 12 nails, had merely been submerged for a brief moment, yet its lid had burst open, and the deceased had vanished. Only the village chief remained composed. "Stop gaping and start searching," he barked. "That body has to be down there somewhere. Young men, get in the water. And you old women, stop wailing and let the men do their work." It seemed that only when yelled at did the people regain their senses. A group of women huddled together nervously, while a few strong men carried the still rigid pallbearer, foaming at the mouth, to the village healer. Meanwhile, others gathered at the edge of the ditch, peering anxiously into the water. The storm had recently brought floods, and though the ditch sat high, the water had risen to an adult's shoulders. The murky current made visibility impossible, and the night wind howled, flickering the torch flames. The atmosphere was thick with an unsettling dread. Thuck, who had been following the procession in silence, turned deathly pale when the coffin fell into the water. He knew that once a coffin had been lifted, dropping it back to the ground was an ominous taboo, not just for the deceased but for everyone present. Now, seeing the empty coffin, his fear deepened. His grandfather had once warned him of the ultimate ill omen, a missing corpse. According to tradition, if the body disappeared from a coffin, none of the 8 bearers would survive. If this truly was the case, then fleeing was the only option. Though Thuck worked in the funeral profession, he was not a pallbearer, yet he knew these taboos must never be ignored. At that moment, he still couldn't comprehend how, after being hoisted onto the shoulders of the funeral band, the coffin had ended up like this. The coffin had surely been nailed shut, so how could the body be missing? As Thuck looked at the scene unfolding before his eyes, he suddenly came to his senses. A chilling numbness ran down his spine, and goosebumps spread all over his body. Even the hairs on his head seemed to stand on end. He screamed loudly, "No! Everyone run! Get out of the water now!" Thuck rushed forward, shouting frantically, but the others only turned to look at him with puzzled expressions. No one understood why he was acting like a madman, screaming at the top of his lungs in sheer panic. It was truly a terrifying moment. Seeing Thuck's strange behavior, Ong Khan, the village chief, quickly tried to calm him down. "What's wrong with you, Thuck? Why are you yelling like that? Run from what?" By this time, Thuck's legs were shaking, and his words came out in broken, stammering gasps. His fear was overwhelming. Meanwhile, a few men had already taken off their shirts and jumped into the water. The villagers, eager to help, didn't hesitate to assist Than and Tak in retrieving the body of the deceased woman. Tak was also searching desperately beneath the cold, murky water, while his wife and child stood on the bank wailing uncontrollably. The women in the village began whispering among themselves, "How unfortunate. She died so painfully, and now, even in burial, things are going wrong." Realizing no one was paying attention to his warnings, Thuck took a deep breath, tried to steady himself, and turned to the village chief. "Back Trong, you must tell everyone to leave immediately. We have to get out of here before it's too late." Only now did Ong Khan seem to take Thuck's words seriously. "What? What nonsense are you talking about, boy? Speak clearly. The body is still down there and you're telling everyone to run. Why would we leave?" Just then, a sudden downpour began, and the wind howled fiercely, making everyone even more anxious. Strangely enough, although the canal was deep, it was a small, confined area. There was only so much space. Yet despite all the young men searching every corner, diving and feeling around in the murky water, the body was nowhere to be found. Some of them had even drifted over 10 meters apart in their frantic search, yet there was still no sign of her. Thuck could only stand frozen in place, his mouth dry and unable to form words. His hands were trembling, and his mind raced with fear. His eyes remained locked on the group of people searching below, now reduced to little more than bobbing heads in the dark, muddy water. Every so often, one of them would submerge, only to resurface moments later with no success. Turning to Ong Khan, Thuck desperately pleaded, "Bak Khan, my grandfather once told me." But Ong Khan cut him off. "What? Your grandfather? What about him?" The village chief instinctively glanced around, half expecting to see an old man standing nearby. At that very moment, his eyes drifted toward the water, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. In the distance, there was a strange figure, someone's head barely visible in the dark, murky water, swaying side to side in an unnatural motion. The flickering light from the torches illuminated the eerie sight just enough to make out its vague shape. Thuck's stomach twisted in fear as he realized what he was seeing. A deep, icy chill spread from his fingertips, numbing him to the core. His lips quivered, and all he could do was stammer in sheer terror. Fear gripped Jong's chest tightly, making it even harder to breathe. The village chief, growing more frustrated, turned and shouted once more, his voice hoarse but laced with worry. "Hey, you there! Are you deaf? Why are you going so far? Come, back here immediately." Upon hearing the chief's command, everyone turned to look at the distant figure, but no one could recognize or confirm if it was their own relative. In the dim, flickering light, only a single head bobbed above the water, making it impossible to make out any clear details. The closest villager, Mr. Thao, who happened to be holding a torch, decided to go check. "Maybe he's too far to hear us," he muttered before striding forward, calling out as he approached. However, as Mr. Thao moved closer, his steps began to falter. A strange feeling crept over him, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. The further he walked, the more unnatural the water seemed. His brows knitted together in unease, his breathing became erratic, and his chest tightened with inexplicable anxiety. His grip on the torch trembled slightly. Finally, when he stretched the light toward the water, he caught a clearer glimpse and immediately screamed in terror. "Oh my God! Everyone come here now!" His shriek sent the villagers into a frenzy, rushing toward him. But by the time they arrived, Mr. Thao had collapsed to the ground, his legs flailing as he frantically scrambled backward, his face as pale as death. Those who arrived first screamed first. Those who arrived later screamed right after. Some clung to each other in fear, unable to look away from the horrifying sight before them. No one dared to run, as if the mere act of turning away might provoke whatever lurked beneath the water to come after them. Even the village chief, Mr. Khan, approached cautiously, only to be stopped by Thuk, who grabbed his arm with trembling hands. His voice was shaky, but he forced himself to speak. "Uncle, my grandfather once said that losing a corpse is a terrible omen, especially when the heavens and earth are acting strangely like this. The water carries lost souls, and death itself may not be what we think it is. Instead, it may be an open gateway, allowing wandering spirits to return." Upon hearing this, Mr. Khan froze, his expression turning stiff as if he had been carved from wood. He stood motionless, unable to process what he had just heard. "Did you hear me, Uncle Khan?" Thuk shook him lightly, trying to bring him back to his senses. Finally, Mr. Khan snapped out of his trance, his face still filled with dread. Are you serious? Are you sure about what you're saying?" Though he didn't fully understand the deeper meaning behind Thus's warning, a sudden realization struck him as he turned to look behind them. The funeral musicians, the entire Phuong Badam, had disappeared without a trace. At some point they had all vanished. Not a single soul remained. Mr. Khan's stomach dropped. His belief in Thuk's words solidified in an instant. Without hesitation, he dashed toward the group still standing at the edge of the water. Their hands, now shaking violently, pointed toward the surface. There, that same eerie head still, swayed back and forth, its movement slow and unnatural. The moment Mr. Khan laid eyes on it, his body lost all strength. He collapsed onto the ground, his screams cutting through the night. "What are you all waiting for? Get out of the water! Get up here now!" A deep, bone-chilling dread spread through Thuk as he slowly began to grasp the horrifying truth of what was unfolding before them. He turned to look around, only to realize there was no way out of this nightmare. He shouted loudly, "Everyone, listen to me! You must get out of the water immediately! This is not a joke!" The crowd murmured in confusion, their eyes filled with panic. Some young men took off their shirts and jumped into the water, diving around the overturned boat, trying to retrieve the body. But no matter how hard they searched, Baoan's corpse seemed to have vanished completely into the murky depths. Hearing the village chief and Tuk shout angrily, the divers quickly swam back toward the shore. Those who could not swim flailed, their arms and legs desperately trying to push against the mud to escape. but the more they struggled, the deeper they sank. "Help! Save me! Someone is grabbing my leg!" A terrified scream echoed from afar, sending a wave of fear through the crowd. Panic turned into sheer horror as they realized another disaster was unfolding. Upon hearing the desperate cry for help, Bakwa's face turned pale. She pushed through the crowd, frantic with worry, searching for her son. Her heart pounded wildly when she saw Tai struggling in the water. "Tai, get to the shore, my son. What's happening? Someone please help my child," she cried, her voice trembling with fear. She clutched a burning torch and rushed forward, stretching out her hand toward him. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded, "Hold on, my son. Grab my hand. Someone, please save him." Tai, barely in his 20s, had lived with his widowed mother all his life, the two relying on each other to survive. Now only his head remained above the water while his body was being dragged down by an invisible force. His lips, pale from fear and cold, trembled as he whimpered, "Mother, my leg. Someone is holding it so tightly. I can't break free." His words sent a chill down Bakwa's spine, intensifying her terror. She feared that her son would meet the same horrifying fate as the others. The villagers on the shore stood frozen in fear. Those who had just emerged from the water were ghostly pale, their faces drained of all color. None of them dared to go back in. And then suddenly they saw it. A head bobbed up and down on the water's surface. It was none other than Tak, Bao An's son. But the sight was so ghastly that no one could believe their eyes. His severed head floated upright, his face twisted in an unnatural expression of agony. Thick, black blood oozed from all 7 orifices of his face, his wide, bulging eyes staring blankly. His mouth gaped open, revealing sharp, bared teeth, biting down on his own exposed liver. The crowd stood in stunned silence, paralyzed with fear. It was impossible to comprehend how a severed head could still move, still float. If this was not the work of a ghost or a demon, then what else could explain such horror? Tuk, his body trembling with urgency, ran toward a nearby bush, breaking off a long branch with leaves still attached. He hurried back, gripping it tightly. His grandfather had always warned him. If he ever encountered such an ominous sign, he should run without hesitation. But could he really abandon everyone and flee? That would make him no better than a coward who valued his own life over his people. If he was going to die, he would rather die with his fellow villagers than turn his back on them. As the branch reached Tai's outstretched hands, Tuk shouted, "Grab it, hold on tight." Bakwa, throwing aside her torch, lunged forward, reaching desperately for her son. On the other side of the tree, T also held on tightly with both hands, his face contorted in pain. 5 or 6 men rushed over, joining in to pull him up, but despite their combined strength, they couldn't move him even an inch. T gritted his teeth, enduring the pain. His hands clenched so tightly that the veins bulged on his arms. Just as everyone was struggling to pull him out, he suddenly cried out, "Mother, I'm sorry!" Before anyone could understand what he meant, a sharp tearing sound echoed through the air. Something had been violently ripped from beneath the water. The people pulling suddenly felt the weight disappear, causing them to stumble backward, tumbling over each other in the chaos. Madame Kwa quickly got up, her eyes darting around in search of her son. Then she let out a piercing scream before collapsing in shock. When the others looked over, they were frozen with horror. Lying on the ground was T, or at least what remained of him. His head, neck, arms, and liver were all that was left. Blood sprayed into the air before gradually slowing to a weak trickle. The liver twitched in rhythm with the spasms of T's mutilated body, giving one last convulsion before becoming completely still. The nightmarish sight was so unreal that if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, no one would have believed. Panic broke out. "Run! Get out of here!" someone shouted in terror. Everything had happened too fast, leaving many still standing in shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. But then, as if an unspoken command had been given, everyone turned and ran frantically toward the village. Even Than and her son, who had been wailing in grief just moments before, abandoned everything and fled, not caring about her mother-in-law anymore. As the villagers rushed past Tak's severed head, it remained eerily still, floating on the water. But anyone who so much as glanced at it felt sheer horror. Its mouth was still biting into the liver, and its eyes seemed to follow them as they ran. The wind howled, growing stronger, and dark storm clouds gathered ominously overhead. Thunder roared across the sky, the sharp cracks of lightning illuminating the terrified faces of the fleeing villagers. The heavy winds whipped through the trees, signaling the approach of yet another storm. The river level was already dangerously high, and if another heavy downpour came, like the one from the night before, the entire village could be swallowed by the flood. Tuck shouted at the top of his lungs, "Everyone, go home and gather your families. Head to the mountains immediately. We must take refuge at Tamjang Temple." He didn't care who fell along the way. He just ran, desperate to find Old Man Khan. "Elder, we must warn the entire village. Tell them to get to higher ground, before the flood comes. I fear our village won't survive this one." Old Man Khan nodded grimly and immediately ordered the men and young boys to split up and spread the warning throughout the village. Despite their lingering fear, the mere mention of the incoming flood made them spring into action. No one hesitated. Those who had lived in the village their whole lives knew that staying behind alone, even if they survived, would only bring unbearable guilt. Tuck, too, turned toward his home, running as fast as he could. He pounded on every door he passed, shouting urgently, "The flood is coming, run, get to the mountain now." One by one, doors creaked open and frightened villagers peeked out. Some barely had time to register what was happening before Tuck grabbed their collars and barked, "Move! Get your family and go!" He sprinted from house to house, spreading the warning, his voice barely audible over the raging wind and rolling thunder. Half the village was already underwater. Those who understood the danger turned pale, hastily gathering whatever essentials they could carry, food, clothes, and valuables, before helping their elderly and young ones toward higher ground. After making sure every house had been warned, Tuk rushed back to his own home. He grabbed a few bits of food, a bottle of water, and a small wooden box that his grandfather always kept by his bedside. Clutching it tightly, he turned and ran back, out into the storm. Hoa and the others hurriedly fleeing from the flood felt an overwhelming anxiety as they rushed toward Tamnang Temple, an ancient pagoda perched atop the highest mountain in the area. Just as they reached the foot of the mountain, a sudden bolt of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating every tree and blade of grass in its blinding glow. Almost immediately, a deafening clap of thunder shook the earth, reverberating in all directions. At the peak of the mountain, where the temple stood, a brilliant streak of light burst forth like a fiery pillar descending from the heavens, casting a vivid glow over the rain-soaked landscape. Thuck stood frozen, staring at the flames engulfing the mountaintop, turning the entire sky ablaze. Those around him, fearing a lightning strike, frantically searched for another path. But Thuk hesitated, for not even a second. Something unseen, a force beyond his comprehension, pulled him toward Tamnang Temple, his heart clenched with an unbearable fear, as if a bolt of lightning was about to strike the person dearest to him. The path up the mountain was steep, with over 1,000 stone steps. On normal days, it would take hours to climb, but Thux sprinted forward, ignoring his burning lungs and trembling legs. His breath came in ragged gasps. His heart pounded violently in his chest, yet he never slowed. He ran as though time itself was slipping away from him. As he ascended, the rain pelted down harder, but the fire atop the mountain continued to rage, as if sustained by an otherworldly power. By the time he reached the peak, exhaustion had drained every ounce of his strength. His legs could no longer support him, and he collapsed onto his hands and knees, crawling toward the ruins of the temple. His vision blurred with fatigue, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and something else. Something unfamiliar and unsettling. The once sacred temple was now reduced to smoldering wreckage, yet the flames danced persistently, refusing to be extinguished by the heavy downpour. Though the temple had not been large, perhaps the size of 3 ordinary village homes combined, it now lay in ruins, engulfed in golden fire that licked at its crumbling remains. What is this? Despite the relentless rain, the fire refused to die, burning as fiercely as before. Then Thuk's eyes caught sight of a shadow amidst the charred debris, a figure seated motionless in the center of the scorched remains. It was a human form, blackened by the fire yet still upright, unmoved by the devastation around them. The figure was seated in a meditative posture, hands pressed together at the chest, face lifted towards the heavens in unwavering devotion. Behind them, the statue of the Buddha had been reduced to ashes, but the monk remained frozen in an eternal prayer. A strangled cry caught in Thuk's throat as tears mingled with the rain streaking down his soot-covered face. Sujian, Sujian, it's me, Thuk, he called out, his voice hoarse and trembling amidst the crackling of the flames. The unmoving figure before him, there was no mistaking it, was Sujian, the reclusive monk whom Thuk and his grandfather had often visited at the temple. Thuk vividly recalled the gentle way his grandfather always called the monk by his old name, Sujian, rather than his ordained title. When Thuk had once asked why, the monk had simply smiled, his deep voice resonating with quiet wisdom. I'm nothing more than an old man on a long journey. The master was not truly a monk. He had chosen to follow the path of Buddhism to atone for past mistakes, to seek redemption, and to erase lingering grievances, not to escape from the secular world. He had kept his old name so that those who still held past debts against him could find him if they wished. The two people closest to Thuk were his grandfather and Sujian. Now, his grandfather was lost somewhere in the world, and Sujian sat motionless amidst the scattered ashes, leaving Thuk with an indescribable pain deep within his heart. Step by step, heavy and slow, Thuk knelt before the charred figure. The flickering flames cast shadows across Sujian's burned, cracked face, which had shrunk and twisted from the heat. Yet strangely, his expression remained one of serenity and fulfillment. But as Thuk's gaze fell upon Sujian's hands, still pressed together in a prayer gesture, he suddenly recoiled in shock, stumbling backward in horror. Hanging beneath those clasped hands was something blackened by fire, yet unmistakable. It was Sujian's lungs. Someone or something had split his body open, leaving his organs spilled onto the stone floor, reeking of burnt flesh and decay. Despite the searing flames, the lungs remained strangely intact, as if serving as a grotesque warning. Panic surged through Thuk. He staggered back, his face drained of all color, stammering, "What? What happened here?" His voice broke amidst the pouring rain and the crackling fire, as though even the heavens were weeping over this horrifying scene. Just then, a chilling gust of wind swept in from behind, making Thuk shudder. A cold, eerie sensation crept over him, an unmistakable warning. Those who had dealt with the supernatural like Thuk knew this feeling well. It was the presence of thick, lingering death energy, a sign of tormented souls. Spinning around, Thuk barely caught a glimpse of a dark shadow darting past his vision, vanishing into the pitch-black night. It moved too swiftly to discern whether it was human or something far worse. Though it disappeared without a trace, it left behind an oppressive sense of dread, as if an unseen force still loomed over him. Forcing himself to steady his breathing, Thuk fixed his eyes on the darkness ahead. In that thick, suffocating atmosphere of death, another scent unexpectedly drifted through the air. It was neither the acrid stench of burning wood nor the decaying odor of death. This scent was different, light, faintly sweet, reminiscent of fields in bloom. Following the fragrance, Thuk moved cautiously forward. When he reached the source, he was astonished to discover that the aroma was coming from a small cluster of rice plants heavy with ripening grains growing right beneath his feet. Kneeling down, he examined them closely, mesmerized. The golden grains were full and fragrant, exuding the rich scent of a bountiful harvest. The sight stirred memories of endless fields stretching beneath the afternoon sun. But this was beyond strange. This land was nothing but dry, barren rock. The temple grounds had been paved entirely with stone, leaving no soil for crops to grow. Yet against all logic, a single rice plant had somehow taken root in this desolate wasteland. And, not only had it grown, It had flourished, bearing golden grains amidst the ruins of death and destruction. Took tried to recall that his grandfather once told him this place had existed for a long time. Later, the villagers renovated it, carving out the mountain rock to pave the entire ground, making it impossible for rice plants to grow here, let alone a lush, ripening stalk of rice. He stood up, looking around as a sense of unease crept into his heart. Why was there a stalk of rice here? And why at this particular time? When had it even started growing? The thought suddenly struck him like lightning, sending a chill down his spine. The question kept echoing in his mind, repeating itself endlessly. Why was the rice growing here, on this land covered in stone? What did this strange phenomenon truly mean? Instinctively, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the white handkerchief his grandfather had left him. He wanted to examine the poem written on it again, but just as he was about to unfold it, a familiar voice called out from behind, snapping him back to reality. It was Mr. Khan. Tuck turned abruptly and saw the village elder staggering forward, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the smoldering remains of the temple. When his gaze fell upon the charred body of Monk Jian, he suddenly dropped to his knees, too overwhelmed to speak. Mr. Khan struggled to form words, his eyes never leaving the ashes of the monk. Tuck, what happened here? His voice was hoarse and trembling. Tuck took a deep breath, his throat tightening. When I arrived, everything was already like this. The temple was engulfed in flames, and Monk Jian, he was already gone. More villagers soon arrived, gasping in shock as they took in the devastating sight. Their sacred temple, once a place of peace, was now nothing but ruins and ashes. Their eyes scanned the scene in disbelief, filled with fear at the rapid and unnatural destruction. One person finally broke the silence, whispering anxiously, "We came up here seeking refuge, and now the Tamjiang temple has ended up like this?" The murmurs spread like drifting smoke, weaving through the cold wind. A strange sense of unease settled over everyone, mixing with the thick, acrid smell of burnt wood and ashes that had yet to cool. Tuck dared not say anything more. He clenched the handkerchief tightly as the words from the poem echoed in his mind, a chilling omen amidst the suffocating darkness surrounding them. More villagers arrived, some women collapsing to their knees, sobbing uncontrollably. It was not surprising, given that Monk Jian had always been a kind and virtuous man, deeply respected by the people here. Their cries of mourning filled the air, blending with the devastation around them. Suddenly, the charred body of Monk Jian, which had remained motionless all this time, unexpectedly collapsed to the ground. His hands, which had been clasped together in prayer, fell open. Something small slipped from his palms, rolling a few times across the stone floor with a cold, hollow clatter. Mr. Khan bent down to pick it up. As he examined it closely, he realized it was a piece of scorched wood, burnt beyond recognition except for a single deeply engraved character that had survived the flames. One word: V. Return. He furrowed his brows, staring at the wooden fragment before hesitantly speaking. Why return? Return where? Who is coming back? The question hung in the air, but no one could answer. They exchanged bewildered glances, each wondering, yet unable to decipher the meaning. It was as if the mystery of the word return had been sealed forever, buried alongside Monk Jian in his sudden and inexplicable death. After a long silence, Mr. Khan sighed. Perhaps Monk Jian foresaw his own passing. This word may be his final message, telling us that it's time for him to return to the ancestors. His words, though uncertain, served as a small comfort amid the confusion. Some nodded, forcing themselves to accept the explanation given by their village elder. Though exhausted, they remained united in handling Monk Jian's final rites. Mr. Khan decided that the monk should be buried right there on the mountain, the place he had dedicated his life to. Tuk, whom the monk had cherished like a grandson, carefully carried out each ritual, bowing deeply and tending to Monk Jian's body with the utmost reverence. At last, Monk Jian was laid to rest beneath the dim glow of the dying flames from Tamjiang Temple, returning to the embrace of the earth in the sorrowful farewell of the villagers. Yet none of them knew that the word return held a far deeper meaning. a forewarning of dark events yet to come. A vague, unshakable fear began to take root in their hearts. Just then, the crowing of a rooster signaled the approach of dawn after a night filled with terror and unexplainable happenings. No one had slept. They simply sat in silence, wrapped in the heavy stillness of the night. A cold wind occasionally swept through, carrying the brief patter of rain before all fell quiet again. Tuck remained deep in thought, recalling every word, every action of his grandfather, trying to find any connection to the cryptic poem. He spent the entire night racking his brain, yet he found nothing. Perhaps the strange rice stalks were merely a coincidence, not an omen of impending misfortune. Just then, the village elder called his name softly. His eyes, weary yet solemn, gazed toward the distant horizon, where the first light of dawn flickered. Sitting beside him, the elder's expression carried a sorrowful weight, as if urging Took to speak. "Have you ever heard of these verses before?" the elder asked. "The earth trembles, the heavens roar, the waters rage, dark clouds soar, thunder crashes, the dragon calls, life and death, Tamjak falls." The verse read, "When the rice flowers bloom atop the stalks, the young lotus sprouts, the old dog carries its pup. When the sorrowful cries echo through the night, the rooster wails, the cat howls like an infant. Then the 5 organs return. Laughter fades, the wandering spirits gather, the ghosts return." After hearing these ominous words, Mr. Khan shifted his gaze to the cloth in Thuk's hands. His eyes widened in shock. Though the dawn had not yet fully broken, a sharp glint flickered in his eyes through the darkness, sending a chill down the spines of those around him. He stood frozen like a stone statue, ignoring Thuk's repeated calls. "Mr. Khan, Mr. Khan." Finally, he muttered, "No, I don't know. Never heard of it before." But his voice, his expression, his hesitation, Thuk immediately understood that the village elder was hiding something. There was more to this than met the eye. Something was being concealed, but pressing him further would be useless. Knowing this, Thuk remained silent, his eyes fixed on the cloth, quietly repeating the poem to himself, word by word, until the first light of morning spread across the sky. As the villagers prepared to descend the mountain, Thuk carefully folded the cloth and tucked it away before following them back to the village. But what awaited them upon arrival left him in utter shock. The village had been swallowed by water. The entire area was submerged. Homes were flooded halfway up their walls. The smaller houses barely remained afloat, bobbing helplessly in the murky water. Thuk's heart pounded as a chilling realization struck him. Had they not fled to the mountain in time, many villagers would have been swept away, lost forever beneath the merciless flood. A child standing nearby tugged at his grandmother's sleeve, looking up with innocent curiosity. "Grandma, has our village ever been flooded like this before? I've never seen the water rise so high." The elderly woman, her clouded eyes distant with memory, furrowed her brows and recalled, "I think it was about 30 years ago. There was a great flood then. Your grandfather led me up the mountain to escape. We were so hungry, we had to eat wild grass to survive for a week. But ever since, even with heavy rains, the water has never risen past our knees." She shook her head. "It's been so long since I've seen such a terrible flood." Hearing her words, an uneasy feeling crept into Thuk's heart. In all his years, he had never witnessed such destruction. The flood was unprecedented. The more he thought about it, the stronger his suspicion grew. Perhaps the poem on the cloth was no mere coincidence. Perhaps it was a warning, a grim prophecy of something far more terrifying, something still lurking beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. The days that followed were a harrowing struggle. The entire village was forced to take refuge in the highlands, crammed together in unbearable hardship. The cries of starving children pierced the cold nights. The elderly, weakened by hunger and exposure, began to succumb one by one. The death toll continued to rise, some taken by the relentless flood, others by starvation and disease. Thuk and a few of the young men took on the solemn task of burying the dead. But they had no coffins, no funeral shrouds. They had only thin straw mats to wrap the bodies before lowering them into the earth. As the floodwaters receded, the entire village was engulfed in the stench of rotting corpses, both human and animal, mixed with the thick, putrid mud that coated everything. No house, whether rich or poor, was spared from the devastation. Mud covered every surface, and waterlogged belongings lay in ruins. Even those with money couldn't buy a single morsel of food. For the past few days, Thuk had remained on the mountain. Every night, he could hear the eerie cries of cats, resembling the wails of children, only far more chilling. The flood had claimed countless animals, from pigs to chickens, buffaloes to dogs. Yet strangely, not a single cat's body was found. Thuk knew cats were agile, quick to escape, and naturally afraid of water, but it was still odd. After all, the village had found nearly a dozen drowned dogs, their bodies collected and buried alongside the larger livestock to prevent decay, but not one cat. While helping the other young men clean up the village and dispose of the animal carcasses, Thuk brought up the strange absence of dead cats. The others paused for a moment, then one of them shrugged, saying, "Cats are smart. The moment they see rising water, they run for higher ground. They can climb too, unlike dogs, which just stand there until the water reaches their bellies before they even think to move." Thuk frowned, deep in thought. It was true. Cats always carried an air of arrogance, their eyes full of disdain. Perhaps that was why he never liked them much. The entire day was spent burying chickens and pigs. Out of the 100 or so households in the village, more than half had owned livestock: pigs, buffaloes, cows, all of which were now gone. The work seemed endless. At night, the villagers gathered at the communal hall, sharing watery rice porridge, scraping together whatever little food was left to survive. After eating, Thuk returned to his home, staring at the ruined, damp walls. The overwhelming stench of rot filled his nose, making him sigh. His heart ached with the memory of his grandfather. The old man had left without a word. Where was he now? Was he safe? A lingering sense of unease gnawed at Thuk. After clearing a small space to rest, exhaustion took over and he drifted into a deep sleep. But in the dead of night, a strange noise jolted him awake. Annoyed, he pulled the blanket over his head, trying to block out the sound. "Whose kid is crying like that? Why aren't they calming it down?" he grumbled. Then, a chilling realization struck him. There were no children in his house. In fact, there were no children anywhere nearby. The youngest child in the village lived nearly 100 steps away, and they were already 8 years old, far too old to cry like that. Could it be someone abandoned a baby? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Thuk sat up, listening carefully. The faint wailing continued, echoing eerily in the silence. His heart pounded as he stepped outside. After the storm, the sky was eerily clear, the nearly full moon casting an ethereal glow over the ruined village. Every broken house, every alleyway was bathed in cold, silver light. He scanned his surroundings, but there was no one in sight. And yet, the cries persisted. Drawn by the sound, he followed the path through the village. The closer he got to the far end, the clearer the wailing became. "This is strange. Why would so many children suddenly be crying at night?" he muttered to himself. Eventually, the sound led him to a familiar but shadowy house. It belonged to Hung, a man who had passed away years ago. He had lived there with his elderly parents, but Hung had never married. He had no children. Then why was there a baby crying inside? Thuk's heart pounded like a war drum. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or an inexplicable fear gripping him. Something urged him forward. He stepped cautiously toward the entrance, his feet sinking slightly into the damp, muddy ground. Standing before the door, he hesitated, breath quickening. The house, already dark and ominous, seemed to loom over him in the moonlight. And then, he reached out to push the door open. The house had been swept away and the fence was in ruins. If not for its sturdy structure, Hero and his father would have had no place to take refuge. Thuk stood still, holding his breath as he tried to adjust his eyes to the dense darkness. "Hero, are you there?" he called softly, not daring to raise his voice, but there was no response. "Hero?" Thuk called out again, louder this time, but the silence remained unbroken. When he peeked inside, something black suddenly darted out like a shadow, accompanied by a gust of cold wind. In the dead of night, the sight sent a shiver down his spine, making him stumble back a few steps, his heart pounding wildly. The creature let out a sharp cry before vanishing into the night without a trace. But in that brief moment, Thuk managed to recognize it. It was a cat. "Hero must be in deep sleep," he muttered under his breath, exhaling shakily in an attempt to steady himself. But just as he was about to collect his thoughts, a sickeningly strong metallic stench hit him. It came from inside the house, not the usual smell of mud or stagnant floodwater. It was familiar yet strangely foreign, as though he had encountered it before but couldn't quite place it. The odor grew so overpowering that Thuk felt his throat tighten. Then, a faint creaking noise echoed in the silence of the night. It came from the bamboo cot inside, as if something was shifting upon it. He stood frozen in place right at the threshold of the house, which seemed to swallow all traces of light. The wailing cries of a baby, which had been ringing eerily moments before, suddenly fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere pressed in from all sides. Under the dim, sickly glow of the moonlight, Thuk could make out Hero and his father lying motionless on the bamboo cot. Their bodies were stiff, curled up in unnatural positions. The moon cast pale light upon their faces, reflecting off their wide-open eyes, pitch black, vacant, and lifeless, staring up at the ceiling. Something was terribly wrong. Their mouths were agape, as if caught mid-scream. Thuk squinted, peering closer, and felt a wave of nausea rise within him as realization struck like a bolt of lightning. Between their teeth were ragged chunks of flesh, still dripping with fresh blood. Strips of raw, crimson tissue protruded from their lips, organs torn apart and half consumed. Among them, a dark, glistening mass hung precariously from Hero's father's mouth. A spleen, drenched in blood, swayed with the slightest movement, each shift sending thick black droplets splattering onto the floor. Horrified, Thuk staggered backward, his entire being overcome with a dreadful sense of unease. The stench of death, of blood, of rotting flesh clung to the air, thick and suffocating. This was no ordinary corpse. This was carnage. The room was smeared with gore, raw flesh strewn haphazardly. He frantically scanned the scene, trying to comprehend what kind of monster could have committed such an atrocity. But just then, the bamboo cot let out another slow, agonizing creak, as if something was still lurking beneath it. His breath caught in his throat as he looked down. A dark pool of blood was slowly seeping from under the cot, thick and viscous, glistening under the moonlight. It spread across the floor, creeping outward like an ominous tide. Then, from the depths of the shadows, a raspy, guttural meow pierced the silence. A small, pitch-black figure slinked forward. Its eyes, glowing a menacing red, burned with a wild, otherworldly hunger. It was a cat, its sleek fur matted with grime and something far more sinister. Clotted blood, seeping in thick rivulets down its body, dripping onto the ground with every slow, deliberate movement. The creature stood between the two lifeless bodies, lowering its head, its rough, bloodied tongue extended outward, dragging across the still quivering flesh dangling from the corpse's mouth. Hung's mouth made slow, deliberate smacking sounds, echoing eerily in the cold silence. Each movement of his jaw was grotesque, as if he were savoring every bite of raw flesh. The wet, chilling noise of chewing and swallowing mixed with occasional, guttural sounds forming a horrifying symphony. Thuk wanted to scream, wanted to turn and run, but his legs refused to move. His entire body felt paralyzed, trapped by the crimson glow of the cat's eyes. Those eyes were nothing like those of a normal animal. They held something far more sinister, a presence filled with malice, a deep-seated grudge accumulated from another realm. The dark figure suddenly snapped its gaze towards Thuk, its glowing red eyes gleaming wickedly in the darkness. It stared at him, bearing a wide, eerie grin. Without a second thought, Thuk forced himself to turn and flee. The rhythmic creaking of the bamboo cot followed closely behind, its sound reverberating in his head like an ominous whisper from the underworld. From the darkness of the house, a final piercing wail rang out, a chilling, drawn-out sound that echoed with an eternal curse as if rising straight from the depths of hell. The eerie cry seemed to cling to him, following him relentlessly as he ran home, each step heavy against the earth, tearing through the silence of the pitch-black night. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, his trembling hands clutching at the wall for support as he reached home. Yet, no matter how far he ran, the horrifying image of Hung and his son remained burned into his mind, their mouths agape, the slick, bloody spleen dangling precariously between their teeth, their lifeless, wide-open eyes frozen in an eternal expression of terror. Trying to steady himself, Thuk leaned against the wall, glancing down at the white cloth he held in his hands. A sudden, foreboding realization hit him. The verses written on it were not mere words, but an omen of death. When the rice flowers bloom on barren land, his thoughts drifted back to the ill-fated rice plant that sprouted from a rocky cliff on the cursed mountain of Tam Jong, a sign the elders once spoke of, foretelling impending doom. From the moment the villagers fled to higher ground to escape the flood, strange occurrences had unfolded. Split lotus stems, phantom pregnancies, and now this ominous verse. But what did it mean? Thuk recalled the old legends passed down through the village. When the night is filled with sorrowful cries, and the cats wail like infants. Wasn't that exactly what he had heard? The eerie howling of a cat, disturbingly, similar to a child's wailing, had echoed through the night. Every sign was manifesting before his very eyes, clear and undeniable. His grip on the cloth tightened as he read further, his breath hitching in horror. When the 5 viscera return, the dead shall rise, the cursed shall wander as lost souls. What did 5 viscera mean? His mind raced, and then it hit him. The gruesome pattern of deaths. The first victim, a young man, had died at a funeral with a liver lodged in his mouth. Then, the monk Jian was found clutching a lung in his lifeless hand. Now Hung and his son lay dead with a half-devoured spleen dangling from their jaws. Thuk shuddered violently as the realization settled in. There were still 2 organs unaccounted for, and 2 more deaths yet to come. Another part of the 5 viscera had yet to appear, the kidneys and the heart. The final lines of the poem spoke of the return of the organs, of the living turning into the dead, and of restless spirits unable to find peace. It lingered like a cruel curse, something beyond comprehension. Thuk couldn't fathom who or what was behind all of this, but one thing was certain. The prophecy was coming true with each gruesome death. Every horrifying sign was unfolding before his eyes. He felt as though he were trapped in a whirlwind of death, unable to escape. The poem seemed to be a prophecy, or worse, an ancient curse that had unknowingly befallen the entire village. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He needed to uncover the origins of these verses, the force that was imprisoning both the living and the dead within this nightmare. Exhausted, Thuk rummaged through the house, searching for any clue his grandfather might have left behind. A charm, a letter, a message, anything. But all he found was an empty, cold and silent home. Fatigue weighed heavily on him, and before long he slumped onto the table, drifting into a restless sleep. His slumber lasted only an instant. Suddenly he found himself standing in the middle of Tamjang village. The sky was as dark as ink, with only a faint, weak moon casting light. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood, filling his lungs with each breath. He turned his head, and what lay before him was nothing short of a waking nightmare. The entire village was drenched in a deep crimson hue, a sea of blood flooding the streets, seeping into the crevices of each house. Thick, dark trails of coagulated blood sprawled across the ground. Scattered everywhere were lifeless bodies, their flesh bloated and discolored, as if they had been submerged in the blood for far too long. Their faces were frozen in twisted expressions of sheer terror, their wide, unblinking eyes brimming with unspeakable horror. But these were no ordinary corpses. Each one had a piece of their own viscera clutched between their lips, livers, spleens, hearts, and lungs. Their bruised, blood-stained mouths were gaping open as though caught mid-chew. Bits of flesh and organs dangled from between their teeth, dripping thick red droplets onto the ground. Thuck's breath hitched as he realized something was moving inside their mouths. Maggots, bloated, pale, and writhing, squirmed through the decaying flesh, feasting on what remained. The air was filled with the sickening squelch of rotting meat, the faint crackling of shifting bones. He stumbled backward, only to find more bodies behind him, their limbs twisted and tangled together in grotesque piles. Torn and tattered clothing barely covered their decomposing frames. Their empty eyes remained wide open, staring at him, as if trying to drag him into their grim fate. His feet sank into the thick pools of blood, creating an awful squelching sound with every step. His entire body screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move, frozen in the middle of the nightmarish slaughter. Then, through the thick veil of darkness, he saw her. A woman stood motionless in the distance, her silhouette barely distinguishable. Her long, blood-soaked hair clung to her pale, swollen shoulders, droplets of crimson glistening as they dripped down her ghostly frame. Her face, it kept changing. One moment she had the gaunt, sunken features of an elderly woman, and the next, her face morphed into something horrifying, drenched in blood with deep, jagged slashes stretching from the corners of her lips to her temples. She was staring straight at Thuck, her red-rimmed eyes locked onto him, unblinking. And then, she smiled. Her eyes burned red like smoldering embers in the night. Thuck saw her lips curl into a sinister grin, her pale, cracked lips slowly parting as thick, black blood oozed from the corners of her mouth. She reached out toward him with her bony, wrinkled hands, fingers stained with fresh blood as if she had just clawed something out from the depths of the underworld. She began to murmur, her whisper echoing inside Thuck's head. The organs, all must return. Blood. Blood will repay blood. The words sank deep into his mind, paralyzing him with terror. He stumbled backward, but suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way. He was pulled into a deep abyss filled with blood and rotting flesh. From above, the woman stood at the edge, laughing maniacally. Her face blurred like mist, yet her laughter remained haunting and sharp, embedding itself into his consciousness. Panic surged through him as he struggled to break free, but the more he thrashed, the deeper he sank. Hands, cold and lifeless, clamped onto his arms and legs, pulling him downward. The corpses stared at him, their gaping mouths still clutching remnants of human organs between decayed teeth. Their dead, unblinking eyes seemed to watch, waiting for him to become one of them. Thuck fought desperately, clawing at the surface, screaming, but his voice was muffled as thick, coagulated blood poured into his mouth. The stench was overwhelming. The icy grip of the dead tightened around him, dragging him further into the abyss. Above the chaos, the woman's laughter rang louder, filling the void. Then, darkness. Thuck jolted awake, his body drenched in sweat. His breath came in ragged gasps, but the chilling echo of that laughter still lingered in his mind. Outside, the first hints of dawn crept through the cracked wooden window. His head throbbed, heavy with the lingering horrors of his nightmare. But was it truly a nightmare? The scent of blood still clung to him, faint but unmistakable. The images from the dream, corpses, blood-soaked streets, the woman's spectral figure, felt too vivid, too real to be mere illusion. A shiver ran down his spine. Morning had come, but the fear had not faded. Thuck sat up slowly, glancing around the dimly lit room. The floodwaters from the storm had receded, yet an eerie silence lingered in the air. He knew, without a doubt, that what he had seen was not just a dream, it was a warning, a terrible omen of what awaited the village. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to find answers. The first person who came to mind was Mr. Khan. The man had acted strangely ever since Thuck had recited the poem on the white cloth back on Mount Tamja. There was something he wasn't telling him. Just as that thought crossed his mind, a sudden gust of icy wind rushed through the cracks of the old house, sending a shiver through Thuka's body. The nightmare was over. But the real horror was only beginning. The door creaked open, carrying with it a heavy dampness and a bone-chilling cold. Thuck pulled his coat tighter around himself, surprised to see the sky suddenly darken. Though it was daytime, the sky was now filled with swirling black clouds, twisting together as if being torn apart by an unseen force, forming eerie shapes. The village, still damp from the recent storm, now felt even more oppressive and heavy, as if forewarning something ominous. Just as he stepped out of the house, Thuk felt the strange atmosphere engulfing the entire village. The dirt roads were still thick with mud, and murky water stretched along the pathways, leaving behind traces of the flood that had swept everything away: homes, livestock, and perhaps even the peace that once belonged to this place. Despite this, Thuk was determined to find Ongkan. He believed that the village elder must know something. Perhaps he was the only one who truly understood the poem and the horrifying deaths that had occurred. Thuk quickened his steps through the muddy road, each footstep feeling heavier than the last. When he arrived, he saw Ong Khan standing outside his thatched house, one hand gripping the doorframe while his eyes stared into the distance, lost in thought. His face bore signs of exhaustion, and his bloodshot eyes hinted at either a lack of sleep or something far worse. Taking a deep breath, Thuk greeted him, trying to keep his voice steady. Ong Khan. The village elder flinched as if pulled from a deep reverie. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something close to fear upon seeing Thuk, but he quickly regained his composure, silently observing the young man before him. Thuk hesitated for a moment before deciding not to beat around the bush. Ong Khan, last night I went to Ong Hung's house. I saw... His voice wavered, but he forced himself to continue. Ong Hung, just like my father. They all died in a bizarre way. Each of them had a piece of their internal organs in their mouths, just like the others. Like Antak, who held a liver, and Su Jian, who clutched a lung. Ong Khan's face turned pale. His lips tightened and his fists clenched, veins visible beneath his skin. His gaze avoided Thuk's as if unable to meet his eyes. Ong Khan. That poem, it's not just a folk tale, is it? You know something, don't you? The poem predicted everything: the deaths, the return of the internal organs. The entire village is trapped in this horror. And last night I saw a woman. She was trying to tell me something about this place, this village. It's cursed, isn't it? Ong Khan stood motionless, his eyes cast downward as if Thuk's words had pierced through to the depths of his soul. Finally, he let out a long, weary sigh, his voice hoarse as he spoke. Thuk, there are things that should never be disturbed. Those prophecies, that they are not mere warnings, they are punishments. Punishments that have been sealed away for a long time. What you saw, that was only the beginning. His voice grew softer, trembling as though even speaking of it drained the last of his strength. A punishment? A seal? What do you mean? Thuk pressed, struggling to contain his frustration. But Ong Khan remained silent, avoiding his gaze. The old man's reluctance only made Thuk more restless. You're still young, Thuk. You don't understand. There are things that do not belong to this world. Some spirits have never left this village. His voice lowered even more. That poem is not a prophecy. It is a curse. Thuk froze, his mind reeling from what he had just heard. The space around him seemed to darken, as if the very air had thickened with dread. A curse? Who cursed this village? He could barely form the words, his heart pounding. And yet, Ong Khan only looked at him with sorrow in his eyes, as if he had just uttered a truth too terrifying to face. The village elder, Mr. Khan, shook his head slightly. His weary eyes revealed deep exhaustion and sorrow. He said nothing more, merely turned around and heavily stepped into his house, leaving Thuk standing alone with a whirlwind of thoughts. In the days that followed that tense conversation, Tamjung village remained engulfed in an oppressive atmosphere. An unshakable sense of unease crept through every corner, seeping into each home. The villagers sensed that something was lurking in the depths of the night, something no longer peaceful, watching, waiting, ready to claim another life. The weather turned strange. Gone were the clear, sunny days. Instead, Dark clouds gathered and thickened in the sky, casting heavy shadows over the village. They loomed over the thatched rooftops and the trees, which had been left bare and battered by past storms. The wind no longer whispered gently but howled through the village in sudden furious gusts, sending shivers down the spines of those who heard it. Leaves rustled violently. Branches scraped against mud-plastered walls, and the eerie silence of the village was punctuated only by the howling wind and the occasional thud of debris hitting the ground. Day by day, the once lively village filled. With the laughter of children and the chatter of daily life grew eerily silent. No children played outside anymore. They clung to their parents, their wide eyes filled with fear. Families hurriedly shut their doors as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. And in the terrifying silence of the night, the wails of cats echoed like distant cries of mourning. Each night their howls grew louder, creeping into the hearts of every villager. Those who were easily frightened found themselves unable to sleep, tossing and turning until dawn, their pillows damp with sweat. Thuk felt himself sinking deeper into an overwhelming dread, as if the shadows were closing in on him. The ominous poem about the return of the 5 organs, each linked to a gruesome death, haunted his thoughts. He knew what was next: the kidneys. Day after day he sought out Mr. Khan, but the elder deliberately avoided him. His evasive demeanor only deepened Thuk's growing suspicion. Mr. Khan knew something, and more than that, he was afraid. Every time Thuk approached, the village elder forced a weak smile before hastily retreating, his eyes darting away, as if refusing to meet Thuk's piercing gaze. It was as if he knew he was about to face something truly terrifying. All of this convinced Thuk that Mr. Khan was hiding a terrible truth, and it only made him more uneasy. Then, one night, the village fell into an even heavier silence. The wind howled through the narrow paths, carrying with it a damp, musty stench rising from the earth, an odor of rot, of things decaying after the flood. Beneath the cold glow of the moon, Thuk sensed something different. The air itself felt strange, and then he heard it. Unfamiliar sounds breaking the silence. Scratching, clawing, the eerie creak of wooden doors shifting, as if someone, was lurking just beyond. In the darkness of the night, the surrounding houses stood eerily silent. Thuk could see shadows gliding past the homes, merging into the depths of the night. By morning, the villagers of Tamjang awoke to horrifying news. Khan, the esteemed village chief, had died under terrifying circumstances. The news spread like wildfire across the dry fields, and within moments, people had gathered in front of his house. Their eyes were filled with fear and uncertainty, their murmurs mixing with hushed whispers of dread. The house of Khan seemed to be swallowed by an ominous shadow, despite the bright morning sun outside. As they stepped inside, a damp chill filled the air, carrying the pungent stench of death. The villagers instinctively backed away, leaving a clear path for Thuk. He moved forward with cautious steps, his pulse quickening as he approached the lifeless body. A dreadful thought crept into his mind. Had the horrific prophecy come true once again? When he got close enough, his body stiffened. Khan lay motionless in the middle of the room, his body rigid, his skin an unnatural shade of pale. But it was his face that sent chills down Thuk's spine. It was frozen in an expression of sheer terror. His eyes were wide open, pupils dilated, as if they had witnessed something unspeakable before death. His lips were slightly parted, twisted into a grotesque and unnatural grin, making his face even more nightmarish. Then Thuk saw something emerging from the man's mouth. A dark, slimy mass dangled between his bloodless lips. It was his kidney. It glistened with fresh blood, hanging grotesquely like a piece of meat suspended in midair. The organ wasn't just protruding, it was shriveled, blackened, and soaked in thick coagulated blood with dark drops slowly dripping onto the floor. Khan's hands were curled into twisted claws, as if he had been grasping at something in his final moments but failed to hold on to it. His arms were bent at odd angles, veins bulging under his bruised skin as though his body had been subjected to immense force. His legs were twisted, one stretched unnaturally, while the other bent, in a disturbing, contorted manner. as if he had been pulled by an unseen force before death claimed him. Around him, the wooden floor was stained with drying blood, filling the room with the nauseating stench of iron and decay. A creeping sensation washed over Thuk. He realized he was not alone. There was something else lurking within the room, something unseen but undeniably present. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound shattered the silence. Thuk stumbled backward, his heart pounding violently in his chest. His gaze darted back to Khan's corpse, and for a brief, horrifying moment he swore he saw the dead man move. He shut his eyes tightly, hoping it was just his imagination. But when he looked again, Khan's wide, lifeless eyes were no longer staring straight ahead. They had shifted ever so slightly, tilting towards him, as if the dead man had turned his gaze upon him. For an agonizing moment, the entire room was suffocating in silence. Then from Khan's stiffened throat, a faint, raspy moan escaped, a whisper that felt like a curse slithering into Thuk's mind like a poison, gnawing at his sanity. Outside, the villagers stood frozen, ears straining to hear the eerie sound seeping from inside the house. But none dared to enter. The low, ghostly groans intertwined with the howling wind outside, forming an otherworldly symphony of dread. And then, Thuk saw it, Khan's shriveled, blackened kidney, twitching ever so slightly. Without thinking, Thuk stumbled backward, distancing himself from the body, his breath shallow and ragged. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Mr. Khan's organ dangled from his mouth as if something inside was forcing it outward. It twitched continuously, and a thick, dark stream of blood began to trickle from the corners of his lips, forming deep red streaks against his pale skin. As Thuk's gaze fell upon Mr. Khan's lips, he saw movement, something writhing from within. Fat, pale maggots squirmed and pushed their way out of the corners of his mouth. Overcome with horror, Thuk bolted from the house, his mind tormented by the sight of those lifeless white eyes swarming with wriggling insects, and the chilling whispers that had escaped from Mr. Khan's lips. He let out a scream, a piercing, shattering cry that tore through the silent morning air. After Mr. Khan's bizarre death, Thuk couldn't ignore the clues hinting at an ancient curse, one that the village chief had seemingly foreseen. The image of the kidney protruding grotesquely from Mr. Khan's mouth and the murmured, ominous words haunted him relentlessly. The phrase, "the dead return," clung to his thoughts like a ghostly echo. He recalled the cryptic warnings Mr. Khan had given about an ancient sin and restless spirits that had never found peace. The village of Tamjang was now engulfed in an even deeper, oppressive gloom. Thuk knew that the collection of organs was nearly complete. Only the heart remained. Bone-chilling winds slithered through the village's alleys, carrying with them an eerie mist. The unsettling stillness hung thick in the air, as if everything was holding its breath before an impending storm of horror. In the following days, the sky remained dark and heavy, the relentless rain pouring down without reprieve. Thuk sat, inside his home, his mind torn between confusion and dread. He reflected on the lessons his grandfather had taught him in childhood, cryptic warnings that now, at last, began to reveal their true meaning. His thoughts swirled chaotically as he struggled to piece together fragments of memory, trying to uncover the hidden truth behind these terrifying events. Night after night, he was tormented by the same nightmare. He found himself standing in the middle of the village, surrounded by ruin and devastation. The entire village was drowning in an ocean of blood. One by one, he watched the villagers collapse, blood gushing from their mouths and noses. Their eyes remained wide open, staring at him in silent agony. Their hands clutched desperately at their chests, as if their hearts had been ripped from their bodies. Not a single soul could speak. They merely stood there gazing at him with bloodshot eyes filled with hatred and resentment. Thuk tried to scream, but the sound choked in his throat. Then, through the dense, ghostly mist, a shadow emerged. A woman. Her long, tangled hair cascaded over her face, obscuring her features. Her thin, frail body was draped in a white dress, stained with dirt and decay. She moved towards him, her feet gliding soundlessly above the ground, her eyes locked onto his. With each step she took, the air grew colder, as if the very essence of death was seeping into the atmosphere. The foul stench of decay clung to her presence. With a jolt, Thuk awoke, drenched in cold sweat. Outside, the rain pounded against the earth, heavier than before. But amid the relentless downpour, another sound reached his ears. The eerie, sorrowful howl of a dog. A strange, inexplicable force compelled him to rise and step outside, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. In the thick curtain of rain, an old dog emerged from the darkness. Its body moved sluggishly, its cloudy eyes reflecting an unfathomable sadness. Its belly was swollen, unnaturally large, as if it carried some grotesque, unnatural burden within. Though its gaze was vacant, there were moments when a flicker of pain passed through its expression. The creature itself seemed to be struggling against an unbearable torment. A sudden thought crossed Thuka's mind, an old poem about a pregnant dog. A chilling realization gripped him. He had to follow it. Following the old dog, he was led down a path to the center of the village. There he found a small lotus pond, and it was here that he saw a figure. His eyes locked onto the silent silhouette of his grandfather, standing under the relentless downpour. The rainwater streamed down the silver-white hair, and his hunched shoulders were lower than before, as though burdened by the weight of 1,000 years. His back seemed to carry the weight of time itself. Step by step, he moved closer to his grandfather. He wanted to ask something, but at the same time he feared what was about to unfold. A strange feeling welled up inside him, a mix of unease, curiosity, and pain. Why was his grandfather standing there in the pouring rain at the exact moment when the village needed him the most? "Grandfather, what are you doing here?" His voice trembled as he called out. His grandfather turned around, his eyes deep and weary, holding a gaze that softened with tenderness but also carried sorrow. "You're here. Why are you here? Where have you been these past few days?" His grandfather sighed, not answering, and once again turned his gaze to the lotus pond where the flowers were blooming. "I know this place," his grandfather said quietly. "This is the village's lotus pond. But now it's different. It's no longer the vibrant pink. The flowers are a dark purple, some with pale pink tips like they've been stained with blood. Some of the lotus stems are strange, growing in uneven clusters, splitting into 2 or 3 branches. They bend and twist, like some distorted creature." At this moment, his grandfather finally spoke again, his voice choked with emotion. "You've seen it all, haven't you?" His voice faltered before continuing. "The deaths have been endless, just as the poem foretold. Now it's my turn." His words left the boy speechless, filled with confusion and disbelief. He couldn't understand what his grandfather meant. "Grandfather? What are you talking about? What about Mr. Khan, Mr. Jian, and the others? Does it all have something to do with you?" His grandfather sighed deeply and his eyes took on a heavy, guilty expression. He slowly moved closer to his grandson, as if to examine his face as though searching for his feelings before the truth was revealed. "You will understand soon enough," his grandfather said softly. "This village, this place where you and I have lived is not just a normal village. It is the very lifeblood of the earth. It holds spiritual energy. And because of this village has always faced hardship, famine, disease, constant suffering. But I found a way to stabilize the life force of this place, to push back the curse that haunts us, but at a great cost." The boy felt a shiver run down his spine as his grandfather's words weighed heavily on him. The silence surrounded them, only broken by the sound of the rain tapping relentlessly against the ground. The sound of the wind whistled through the night, carrying an eerie chill. Thuk trembled, his body frozen in place as he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper, "Nu Tung Talin, what exactly is this ritual?" His grandfather, Ong Thung, nodded slowly before continuing. "Nu Tung Talin is an ancient ritual, one that requires the 5 vital organs of a person whose birth chart is purely of yin energy. These organs are buried in 4 cardinal directions, with the heart placed at the very center of the land. This ritual binds the soul to the very veins of the village, gathering the essence of earth and sky to sustain the land itself." Thuk's breath hitched and his mind reeled as realization struck. The person with the purely yin birth chart was his mother. His entire body went numb. The weight of the truth crushed him, cold and suffocating. His heart pounded wildly against his ribs as he gasped out, "What? What did you just say? My mother? She died because of the seal?" The rain fell in sheets, a whispering echo of sorrow in the darkness. Ongtan bowed his head, his voice heavy with guilt. "Yes. Your mother was the only one who could complete the sealing ritual. Her sacrifice ensured the balance remained intact. But she never knew the cost, never realized that her soul would be forever trapped, unable to find peace. And now she is returning, bringing with her all the pain and resentment that has festered for years." Thuk's entire world crumbled in that moment. His mother had been sacrificed. Ongtan's voice was barely audible over the storm, but each word cut into Thuk like a blade. "Years ago, it was I, Sujian, and village chief Khan who made the decision. We sacrificed your mother to complete the ritual." A violent tremor ran through Thuk's body. The unbearable weight of grief and rage surged within him like a tidal wave, breaking past the barriers of reason. His fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms, but the pain was nothing compared to the agony burning in his heart. Every word from his grandfather was like a dagger twisting deeper into his soul. You killed my mother?" His voice cracked, torn between disbelief and fury. "Everything I believed in, everything I trusted, it was all a lie?" His chest heaved, breath ragged. His grandfather, the man who had raised him, cared for him, given him a home, was also the one who had condemned his mother to death. His voice broke as he demanded, "Then tell me, if my mother was sacrificed, where is my father?" Ongtan fell silent. His aged eyes glistened with unshed tears as he struggled to speak. Then, in a hoarse whisper, he finally admitted, I am not your real grandfather." Thuk staggered, back as if struck. His mind could not process what he had just heard. What did you just say? Your mother was not from this village," Ongtan continued. "Years ago she arrived here carrying you, just a newborn baby in her arms. No one knew who your father was. And when she died, I carried the guilt of what we had done for years. But when I saw you, I couldn't leave you behind, so I took you in. I tried to make amends by giving you a peaceful life. I only hoped that one day your mother would forgive me." The world around Thuk blurred. His thoughts spiraled into chaos, drowning in the horrifying truth that had just been laid bare. Rage and grief clashed within him. The man he had called grandfather for his entire life was no longer the kind, protective figure he had always known. He was the one who had orchestrated his mother's death, the one who had shackled her soul to this wretched land. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped Thuk's lips, his body trembling with uncontained fury. "So now, what exactly do you want from me?" His voice dripped with venom. "Are you expecting me to forgive you? To pretend none of this ever happened?" Ongtan lowered his head, his voice weak and frail. "No, I do not seek your forgiveness. I only ask for your help to break the curse." Thuk's breath hitched. His entire being recoiled at the thought. "When your mother returns," Ongtan continued, "her soul will unleash death upon every person involved in sealing her fate. Khan is already dead. Sujian has also perished. And now, I am the last one. My heart, the final organ, remains. Once it is offered, the ritual will be complete, and her soul will be freed." Thuk's mind went blank. He could barely comprehend the weight of the words pressing down on him. His mother's sacrifice had left behind nothing but pain, sorrow, and an unrelenting thirst for vengeance. Everything, his entire life, had been built on a lie. Ongtan's voice wavered, filled with desperation. "I only ask that you plead with her. Beg her to spare the villagers. They had no part in this. They do not deserve to suffer for my sins." Thuk stood frozen. The storm raged on, mirroring the turmoil within his heart. His mother's return would not bring peace. It would bring destruction. The weight of an unbearable truth settled upon him. The sacrifice of his mother had left behind nothing but a legacy of hatred and sorrow. His mother's soul had been unable to move on, trapped in endless suffering. And now the final price to be paid was his grandfather's life. A cold, merciless thought flickered through Thuk's mind. So his grandfather had only kept him alive until now because he had a final use for him? Was this why? What if he refused to help? What if he let his mother take her revenge? As Thuk was drowning in rage and bitterness, a deafening clap of thunder roared across the sky. The storm intensified and rain poured down in thick, unrelenting sheets, heavier than before. Water gushed like a waterfall, flooding the land at an alarming rate. The wind howled, twisting into violent gusts strong enough to uproot bushes and send leaves spiraling through the air. The entire world seemed to be unraveling, as if nature itself was responding to the wrath of an unseen force. Thuk stood frozen, eyes darting around. The rain blurred the horizon, making it impossible to distinguish the sky from the earth. Mud splattered as water pooled rapidly at his feet. Amidst the howling wind and torrential rain, he could hear something else. Wails of agony, cries of despair. It was the villagers. Their voices cut through the storm, filled with terror. People called out to each other in desperation as the rising water engulfed them up to their waists. Waves of floodwater surged down from the mountains, crashing into their fragile homes. A rickety thatched house was swept away in an instant, vanishing into the chaos like a fallen leaf in a raging river. Panic-stricken screams blended with the wind, forming a symphony of despair. Thuk turned sharply toward his grandfather. Ang Than was kneeling in the downpour, face lifted to the heavens, eyes tightly shut as if accepting his fate. Slowly, he raised a trembling hand, beckoning Thuk to come closer. His voice, though weak, carried an urgent plea. "Thuk, my child, please beg your mother for mercy. Ask her to spare this village. I will offer my heart willingly, if only to grant her peace, to let her move on. But I beg of you, plead with her on behalf of these people. They had no part in this crime. I know I do not deserve her forgiveness. I know I must pay for my sins. But the villagers, they should not have to suffer for my mistakes." Thuk stood, paralyzed, staring at the ruins of the village, the shattered homes, the flood swallowing everything in its path, the desperate cries echoing through the storm. His breath caught in his throat. Could he really turn away? Tears blurred his vision as he turned back to his grandfather. The old man's eyes, heavy with regret, searched his own. Thusia's voice trembled as he finally spoke, his words barely audible over the storm. "If you can hear me, Mother, please, Mike, stop this." The moment the words left his lips, an icy chill swept through the air. Everything fell silent. The rain, the wind, even the cries of the villagers, all seemed to freeze in time. The world became eerily still, trapped in a suffocating, unnatural quiet. Then, from the mist of rain, she appeared. A woman. Her figure was blurred, as though she had stepped out of a forgotten dream. Long, tangled hair clung to her pale face, her skin ashen and lifeless. Her hollow, sunken eyes were as black as an abyss, void of warmth, void of humanity. She wore a tattered white robe stained with mud and decay, wrapped around her frail frame. She did not speak. She did not move. Yet her presence alone sent a bone-deep chill through Thuk's body. He could feel it, her pain, her hatred. It seeped into his very soul, a darkness so overwhelming that it left him breathless, a hatred that could never be soothed, a sorrow that could never be erased. Ang Tan shuddered violently, unable to stand any longer. He slowly fell forward, bowing low. Before her, his frail body trembling. The strength he had clung to all these years was gone. He was powerless before the spirit of the woman he had wronged. "I know. I deserve to die. His voice wavered, barely above a whisper. "But please, spare the villagers. I will give you my heart. If that is what you seek, then take it and find peace." She said nothing. Her cold, soulless gaze remained fixed on him, unreadable, unyielding. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. Her feet never touched the ground. She glided, her movement an eerie, weightless drift, prolonging the unbearable, anticipation stretching the terror that gripped Thuka's chest. Then, she finally spoke. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You think one heart is enough to grant me peace?" A chilling smile spread across her ghostly face, and at that moment, Thuk realized her vengeance was far from over. Thuk's fingers and toes curled involuntarily as a wave of fear paralyzed him. His body trembled, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He turned to look at Ong Tan and saw the old man's expression shift from sorrow to sheer horror. His hands trembled violently. The woman leaned down, her hollow, pitch-black eyes locking onto him. A twisted, grotesque smile crept across her pale lips. "You killed me," she whispered, her voice thick with venom. "You stole my life, my peace, all to save this village. You offered my organs to fortify the so-called dragon vein to alter the village's fate. But did you ever, even for a moment, think of the agony I suffered?" Her voice grew harsher, trembling with rage. "Did you, old man?" She leaned in closer, her words turning into a guttural growl. "And now you think offering your heart will be enough to atone? You think I will forgive you? That I will forgive any of you for throwing me into a pit of endless despair?" Ong Than collapsed fully onto the ground, his forehead pressed into the wet, muddy earth. The weight of her wrath bore down on him like a crushing force. He shuddered violently, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, I beg you, let me go." A sharp, bone-chilling laugh erupted from the woman's lips. The sound echoed through the storm, slicing through the night like shattered glass. Her black eyes burned with fury as she stretched out a thin, bony hand reaching toward him. Her fingers curled like claws, ready to rip out his heart. She barely moved her hand, yet the air itself twisted around her in a furious vortex. A whirlwind of cutting wind lashed against Ong Tan, sharp as invisible blades. The old man let out a strangled scream as deep gashes tore across his body, his flesh splitting open as if carved by unseen knives. "Mother, stop!" Thuk's desperate scream cut through the chaos. His tears mixed with the rain, his entire body trembling as he reached out toward the vengeful spirit. The woman paused. Slowly, she turned her gaze toward him. For the briefest of moments, something flickered in those dark, empty eyes, a hint of regret, a whisper of hesitation. But it was fleeting. Hatred quickly drowned out that momentary weakness. "My son," she murmured, her voice laced with sorrow. "Because of this village, you lost everything. From the moment you were born, they stole from you. Your mother, your home, your past." Her words sent a shiver down Thuk's spine. "Remember this," she continued, her voice like a haunting melody. "Look closely. Engrave their cruelty into your heart. Never forget what they have done to us." Behind her, Ong Tan still knelt on the rain-soaked ground. The storm raged on, rain mingling with his blood, turning the earth beneath him into a thick, dark sludge. He shivered violently, eyes filled with despair. Before him stood the ghost of Thuk's mother, a skeletal broken figure draped in a tattered burial shroud. Her long, drenched black hair clung to her pallid face. Those empty black eyes reflected no light, no warmth. She was beyond reason. She had no interest in his pleas. She had no desire for forgiveness. With terrifying speed, her hand shot forward. Her elongated, claw-like fingers plunged into Ong Tan's chest. The sound was sickening. His body convulsed as her nails tore through his flesh, piercing through muscle and bone as if they were nothing more than paper. His clothes darkened with blood as her fingers sank deeper, searching. Ong Tan let out a ragged, guttural scream, but his voice was drowned out by the howling storm. His body jerked violently as he gasped for breath, his mouth open in a silent cry. His eyes rolled back and his lips trembled as the pain overtook him completely. Blood spilled from his mouth, trickling down his chin, mixing with the rain. His heart pounded furiously, each desperate beat sending another burst of crimson spilling onto the mud. And then, she found it. Her fingers curled around his still-beating heart. Ong Tan's body stiffened, his final breath caught in his throat. Without hesitation, she tightened her grip and tore it from his chest. A fresh torrent of blood gushed forth, pouring over her pale fingers as she lifted the heart from his broken body. It pulsed weakly in her grasp, still clinging to life. Even in death, his body twitched as if his very soul refused to let go. The woman's lips curled into a cold, mirthless smile. She stared at the dying heart in her palm, her black eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction. Then slowly she lowered her head and opened her mouth. Her lips parted as if she were about to devour the heart whole. Her darkened, lifeless mouth opened wider, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth that sank deep into the still beating organ. She sucked greedily, draining every last drop of blood, leaving behind nothing but a withered, dried husk. Ong Tan had no strength left. His body trembled, his pale, contorted face frozen in agony. His eyes fluttered shut, drained of all life. The woman let the shriveled heart slip from her fingers, letting it fall limply to the ground. A low, guttural laugh rumbled from deep within her throat. Her cold, black eyes swept over Ong Tan's lifeless body before turning back to Thuk. Her gaze was heavy with sorrow, yet beneath it lurked an abyss of hatred. Those empty, endless black eyes bore into him, piercing through his soul, filling him with an unbearable chill. Thuk staggered forward, kneeling beside Ong Tan. His chest tightened as he looked into the old man's clouded eyes, the life in them already fading away. Thuk clutched his grandfather's limp hand, his whole body trembling. His own eyes darkened, his breath uneven. Rage boiled inside him. Hatred for the village of Tam Jang surged through his veins, an unstoppable tide of fury. This village, this cursed village, had stolen everything from him. They had taken his mother. They had taken the only man who had ever cared for him. Was this fate's cruel joke, or had it all been inevitable? Thuk threw his head back and screamed, his voice raw and filled with anguish. The storm roared in response. Suddenly, the earth trembled beneath him. A violent quake shook the entire village. The ground split open, sending waves of mud and debris into the air. The small thatched houses, weak and worn with age, began to sway dangerously, their wooden beams creaking under the force. A deep, resonant sound rumbled from beneath the earth, a ghostly wail that sent shivers through the land. And then, the voices came. Distant, tortured cries echoed from beneath the soil, the voices of countless souls long forgotten. The wind howled, carrying their wails through the village, making the trees shudder and the grass quiver. The earth cracked beneath Thuk's feet, and from its jagged crevices a thick black mist slithered upward, spreading like an ink stain in water. Thuk's eyes widened in horror as he looked into the distance. The villagers were screaming. Panic erupted in the streets. People ran, stumbling over one another as they tried to escape the encroaching darkness. Their frantic cries for help pierced through the storm, but no one could save them now. The mist moved like a living thing, twisting and coiling through the air. And then, it began. The villagers' screams turned into something else, something inhuman. The black mist wrapped itself around them, forcing its way into their mouths, their noses, their very souls. Their bodies convulsed, limbs jerking in unnatural angles. And then, silence. Their eyes, once filled with fear, became vacant, empty voids of nothingness. Their skin paled to an unnatural gray. Their expressions slackened into eerie, hollow masks. They were no longer human. They wandered aimlessly through the village, their steps unsteady, their bodies moving as if controlled by unseen strings. One by one, they succumbed. The living had become the dead. Thuk's heart pounded against his ribs as the realization struck him. This was it. The final curse. The prophecy had come true. Everywhere he looked, the people of Tamjang were transforming. Mindless, soulless husks, staggering through the rain, their faces twisted in silent horror. The floodwaters rose higher, swallowing the streets. The murky tide carried away debris, animals, corpses. And then, among the floating wreckage, Thuk saw them. Pale faces, wide, unblinking eyes staring blankly at him from beneath the water's surface. The faces of the dead, the drowned. Their mouths gaped open as if gasping for air, though they no longer breathed. Their bloated hands reached upward, as if trying to claw their way back to the world of the living. Thuk gasped, stumbling backward, his breath coming in shallow bursts. And then, the shadows moved. The outlines of figures flickered in the heavy rain, silhouettes dancing between the trees and rooftops. The spirits had awakened. The lost souls, those who had been sacrificed long ago in blood rituals meant to strengthen the dragon vein, had returned. The forsaken dead had risen. The spirits hovered, just beyond sight, their blurred forms melting into the night, their whispers curling around Thuk like smoke. One by one, they turned their attention toward the remaining villagers. A dreadful wail tore through the sky. The shadows descended. The ghosts surged forward, sweeping through the village like a relentless storm. Wherever they passed, life was snuffed out. The villagers fell like broken dolls, their eyes rolling back as their bodies crumpled to the ground, soulless and empty. Thuk could only stand there, helpless, as chaos consumed everything around him. The village of Tamjang had finally met its end. They collapsed, their bodies slowly overtaken by the evil shadows, transforming into mindless puppets, wandering aimlessly through the endless rain. Thuk looked around, his heart filled with fear and despair. Everything he had done, all his struggles, had been in vain. He was powerless against the curse, against the overwhelming hatred that had festered for so long. The floodwaters rose higher, carrying with them mud, rocks, and debris as landslides crashed down from the mountains, swallowing everything in their path. Tamjang, once a home, once a village filled with life, had become a wasteland, a land of the dead. The living had become soulless corpses roaming the darkness without purpose. The dead had returned, consumed by an eternal thirst for vengeance. Thuk watched it all unfold. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a hollow, broken sound, his tears blending with the relentless downpour. "Grandfather, Onghan, Sujian, you sacrificed my mother. The entire village turned against you, and now she has wiped them all out." His voice cracked, filled with grief and rage. All of this, for what? Why didn't you just leave? Why cling so desperately to the dragon vein? For power? For prosperity? And now, what's left? There was no answer, only silence. Thuk stood there motionless, his figure barely visible through the storm. Then, like a shadow dissolving into the night, he vanished. No one knew whether he had lived or died. Dear friends, you have just listened to the thrilling and mysterious horror story about the haunted village filled with ghosts and spirits. If you find it meaningful and useful, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, share, and subscribe. Also, consider joining the membership program to support the channel. Let's reach the significant milestone of 100,000 subscribers, a truly memorable achievement for YouTube creators. Once again, thank you for your interest and support. Best regards, and see you in the next videos.